She was 21 and homeless. No room, no wages, no address anyone could use, just a canvas satchel and $5 she had kept flat inside an envelope since the day the sheriff's deputy locked the porch behind her. And with that amount, she bought a forgotten lithography studio on the lower riverside of Galena, in Joe Daviess County, Illinois, where the Riverside printing row had fallen off county maps in 1958. The north wall leaned 3 inches out of plumb. Rain had opened the roof seam above the press room. The county had condemned it since 1971 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that beneath the limestone printing block in the rear workroom, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 60 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Clara Mae Whitcomb had been disappearing her whole life without knowing it. She began in rooms where adults lowered their voices before she entered, as if even ordinary weather belonged to people who had earned the right to speak. Her childhood was spent in narrow rentals along the Illinois side of the river, places with brown radiators, window sashes swollen by damp, and kitchen drawers that held more bills than spoons. She learned early how to move without waking anyone, how to close a cabinet with 2 fingers, how to make one slice of bread seem like breakfast if she toasted it slowly and cut it across. Her father had been gone before she had enough memory to arrange him into a shape. There was one photograph of him standing beside a delivery truck, sleeves rolled to the elbow, his face half turned toward a sun the camera did not catch. When Clara was 8, she found that photograph in a shoebox under her mother's bed and carried it to the kitchen, holding it by the corners, careful as if the paper might bruise. Her mother looked at it for a long time, then took it away and said only that he had worked too hard. After that, Clara did not ask often. The house did not reward asking. It rewarded usefulness. She washed cups before school, folded towels into thirds, clipped coupons along dotted lines, and came to understand that being unnoticed was not always the same as being unwanted. There were mornings when her mother tied Clara's hair at the nape with a fraying ribbon and rested one hand on the child's shoulder longer than necessary. There were evenings when that same mother sat at the edge of the bathtub with her work shoes still on, face blank with fatigue, listening to water drip from a faucet that could not be fixed until Friday. Ruth Whitcomb was not cruel in the way stories sometimes make a person cruel. She was tired. Tiredness had narrowed her until she could pass through a day without touching its sides. She cleaned rooms at a riverside inn, then took laundry home in plastic sacks, pressing other people's shirts on a board set between 2 chairs. When she spoke to Clara, her words were usually instructions, not because there was no tenderness left in her, but because tenderness required a pause, and there was almost never a pause. Clara understood this before she had language for it. She did not blame her mother. Blame seemed like a luxury for people with locked doors and full cupboards. The person who did pause was her grandfather. His name was Elias Whitcomb, and he lived alone above a shut-down feed store in a town that had once believed in the river more than the highway. Every Saturday, Ruth put Clara on the early bus with a paper sack lunch, and every Saturday, Elias met her at the stop wearing a brown felt hat, a wool coat shiny at the cuffs, and spectacles that slid down his nose when he smiled. He had hands broad as garden spades, the left thumb flattened from an accident he never described fully, and a smell of linseed oil, black tea, and stone dust that became, for Clara, the smell of being expected. Elias had been a printer in the last years when some people still cared how ink lay upon paper. Not a newspaper man. He always corrected. Not a copier. Not a fellow who pushed buttons and trusted a machine to make every mark identical. He had been trained in lithography by his own father, and though the trade had thinned out until it was almost no trade at all, he kept his tools in exact order in the back room of his apartment. The room was not large, but to Clara it had the gravity of a chapel. There were leather rollers on wooden racks, brass scrapers, gum arabic in labeled jars, chalks wrapped in paper sleeves, a drying line with clips darkened by years of use, and 3 limestone blocks laid on a low bench beneath canvas covers. On cold mornings he warmed the room with a kerosene heater and made Clara sit with her hands around a mug before he allowed her to touch anything. Not because the tools were too precious, he said, but because cold hands hurried. Their ritual did not change much across the years. First tea. Then sweeping. Then he would lift the canvas from one stone and let Clara run her fingers just above the surface without touching it, feeling the idea of smoothness before feeling the surface itself. He taught her that Bavarian limestone held both water and grease in its memory, though not in the same places. He taught her to draw with a greasy crayon, to dust rosin lightly, to etch with gum and a measured breath of nitric acid, to keep a sponge damp but never dripping. He made her count seconds aloud while the solution rested. He made her wipe the stone in circles, then in lines, then circles again, until her wrist learned patience. By 12, she could grind ink on glass with a palette knife, folding it until it shone like a black river at night. By 14, she could tell when the roller carried too much tack by the faint tearing sound it made on the slab. By 16, she knew the difference between a careless mark and a living one. Elias never praised loudly. He would look through his spectacles, nod once, and set the print on the line. That was enough. On some Saturdays, when rain made the windows silver, he told her where the craft had gone. He spoke of German families who had carried stones and recipes across the Atlantic, of advertisements printed for seed, catalogs and river packets, of wedding portraits, opera posters, maps, labels for tins of peaches and flour sacks. He spoke of Galena before it became a town people visited for the past, when it was crowded with lead miners, merchants, steamboat men, and women who washed ink from their husbands' cuffs in basins behind print shops. He spoke as if the vanished workmen were not gone, only standing somewhere beyond the wall, waiting for someone careful enough to call them back. Clara listened. She was good at listening. Once, when she spoiled an image by over-inking the stone and stood frozen with the roller in her hand, Elias took the tool from her and set it down gently. Ink tells the truth if the hand lets it. He said it without scolding. And then he showed her how the mistake had happened. Too much pressure. Too little water. A hurry so slight she had not felt it enter her wrist. The sentence stayed with her because it was not only about ink. It meant that work could not be bullied into honesty, and neither could a person. It meant that some things revealed themselves under even pressure, with time, by being handled exactly as they were. She carried that lesson longer than she carried most belongings. Elias died in March of the year Clara turned 19. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but by degrees, as winter gives up a field. He had been coughing through the previous autumn, then sitting more often between tasks, then writing labels for jars he already had labeled twice. Clara found him one Saturday at the kitchen table with his tea untouched, looking embarrassed by his own weakness. He asked her to fetch the blue folder from the workroom shelf. Inside were notes in his careful hand, recipes, measurements, names, places, a lineage of craft and kin threaded together. Keep what you can, he told her. Those were among the last clear words he gave her. After the funeral, there were decisions made in offices Clara was not invited to enter. Her mother said there was no money for storage. Her older brother Nathan said nobody wanted 100-pound rocks and antique clutter. The landlord wanted the apartment emptied by the end of the month. Clara wrapped the rollers in newspaper herself and marked boxes with a pencil. But when she returned 2 days later, half the room had already been cleared. The stones were gone. The leather rollers were gone. The brass scrapers, the glass slab, the apron stiff with honorable stains. Gone. Even the blue folder had vanished from the shelf, though Clara searched every drawer and cupboard until her fingers came away gray with dust. Nathan said the haulers must have taken it by mistake. He would not meet her eyes. Nathan Whitcomb had her father's height and their mother's gift for making silence do work. He was 8 years older than Clara, broad-shouldered, handsome when he cared to be. With dark hair he combed straight back and shoes kept too polished for a man who claimed he could not find steady work. He spoke softly in public. That made people trust him longer than they should have. He could stand near a grieving person with his head bent and look as if grief had deepened him, though Clara had learned to watch his hands instead of his face. His hands were restless. They searched pockets. They tapped table edges. They folded receipts into squares and unfolded them again. In the months after Elias died, Nathan began visiting their mother's duplex more often. Arriving late, leaving early, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and cologne from bar bathrooms. He brought groceries once, a bag of oranges and canned soup, and Ruth received them with such visible relief that Clara looked away. After that, Nathan's place at the table seemed fixed, even when his chair was empty. There were calls at odd hours. There were envelopes pushed beneath the door. There were men in parked cars who kept their engines running while Ruth stood behind the curtain and pretended not to see. Clara learned that gambling debts did not always arrive shouting. Sometimes they came in the patient form of a man leaning against a telephone pole, reading the same page of a newspaper for 20 minutes. Sometimes they came as a knock that stopped before anyone answered. Sometimes they came as her brother's laugh from the kitchen, low and easy, while her mother held a bill in both hands. Nathan did not strike anyone. He did not need to. He let trouble enter the house first, then acted like the only man tall enough to stand between it and the door. By then, something had already been taken. Clara began finding gaps. A silver serving spoon from Ruth's wedding box. Elias's pocket watch. The cedar chest key. A jar of change from the laundry shelf. When she asked after these things, Nathan looked wounded, and Ruth looked at the floor. It was a pattern as delicate and exact as a print pulled from stone. Clara saw it, and because she saw it, she became inconvenient. On October 17, 2022, the eviction came with dry leaves gathered along the curb and frost still holding in the shadow of the porch. The deputy was younger than Clara expected. He had a pale mustache, a county jacket zipped to his throat, and a clipboard he held against his chest as if it were a shield. Beside him stood a woman from the mortgage company in a black coat, her hair cut in a sharp line beneath her chin. Their voices were not unkind. That made it worse. Cruelty might have given the morning shape, but procedure only flattened it. Ruth sat at the kitchen table with her purse in her lap. Nathan was gone by then, gone in the night with the last of Elias's box papers, 2 borrowed credit cards, and whatever money had been left from selling the tools Clara had tried to protect. He left no note. He did not need one. His absence had a signature. The physical object Clara remembered most was not the clipboard or the deputy's key. It was a blue enamel bowl sitting in the sink, chipped at the rim, holding 3 spoons in soapy water. She had washed everything else the evening before. Those 3 spoons remained, and in the cold October light they looked like a question nobody meant to answer. The woman in the black coat read the paper aloud. Clara heard phrases without catching them whole. Default. Possession. Court order. Vacate. She looked at her mother, waiting for Ruth to say that Clara had paid rent from diner wages, that Clara had skipped meals to keep the power on, that Clara was not merely a daughter sleeping in a corner room but a person whose life had been folded into that place. Ruth's hands tightened around her purse. The deputy touched the edge of the door. "Your name is not on the deed. Clara." 8 words. Careful words. Words that did not raise their voice because they did not have to. Clara looked again at her mother, and Ruth lowered her eyes to the purse clasp and pressed it shut with both thumbs. That was the betrayal. Not a shout. Not a curse. A tiny silver click. Clara packed one change of clothes. Elias's brown felt hat, a cracked mug wrapped in a towel, and the canvas satchel she had used since high school. From a drawer beneath the bed, she took the envelope with $5 in it, money she had kept from a church rummage shift, and never spent because Elias had once told her every person needed a bill that was not already promised to somebody else. She slid it inside her sock. The rest stayed or was placed on the curb. Books. Curtains. A lamp with a crooked shade. The blue bowl. By noon, the porch was locked behind her. For 6 weeks, Clara lived by moving. She first went north to Freeport because the bus fare was cheapest and because she had seen job postings there once, printed on orange paper at a grocery entrance. She slept 2 nights in the back pew of a church whose side door did not latch, waking before dawn to leave no evidence but warmth in the wood. She washed in the library restroom with paper towels that scratched her wrists. She applied at a bakery, a nursing home kitchen, and a motel where the manager looked at her satchel and said they were no longer hiring. From Freeport she rode with a woman who sold handmade wreaths at holiday fairs and let Clara sit among bundles of cedar and ribbon in the back of a van. The woman left her in Rockford with a muffin, 2 clementines, and an apology for not doing more. Clara thanked her until the woman looked embarrassed, then walked to the public transit station and spent the night upright between a vending machine and a payphone nobody used anymore. Her money had become $4.12, not counting the $5 bill in the sock, which she had begun to think of as something other than money. A boundary, perhaps. A small private door. In Rockford she found 2 days of dishwashing paid in cash. The restaurant owner counted the bills twice and subtracted meals she had not known would be charged. Clara accepted the remainder without argument. Argument required a place to return to afterward. She ate crackers and peanut butter from a dollar store, then took a morning bus west with windows clouded by breath, crossing flat fields where corn stubble stood in rows like the bristles of a worn brush. Dubuque gave her 3 colder nights. The first under a concrete stair beside a parking ramp, where the river wind came through every seam in her coat. The second in a laundromat after midnight, pretending to wait for clothes while an empty dryer turned because she had fed it quarters for heat. The third behind a mission that had run out of beds but offered soup in a paper bowl. She sat with men who smelled of wet wool and tobacco, women with swollen ankles, a former school secretary who carried her documents in a plastic bread bag. Nobody asked Clara for her story. She was grateful for that. By then her ordinary coins were almost gone. $3.18. Then $2.40. Then 91 cents after coffee she bought because her hands shook too badly to fill out another application. She kept the $5 untouched, folded twice, inside the envelope, inside her sock, against the arch of her foot. It softened with walking. The paper grew warm from her body. She did not call her mother. She did not look for Nathan. Some doors, once shut from the other side, did not deserve a second knock. In the evenings, when libraries stayed open, Clara went where heat was free and chairs did not require purchase. She learned the hours of the Freeport Public Library, the Rockford Main branch, the Carnegie Stout building in Dubuque with its wide steps and lamps that made even tired faces look studied. She read newspapers for want ads, county notices, estate sales, auction scraps, any printed thing where need might have hidden a door. Her finger moved down columns of type the way Elias's finger had once moved along the edge of a stone, searching for flaws, for openings, for the place where pressure had changed the surface. It was at the Galena Public Library, on a Thursday afternoon with sleet ticking softly against the windows, that she found the classified ad. She had come there because the bus from Dubuque was cheaper than the shelter fee, and because Galena, with its hills and brick storefronts, looked from a distance like a town that had kept more than it lost. Inside the library, she sat near a radiator beneath a framed photograph of Main Street in 1897. Her coat steamed faintly at the hem. Her shoes had begun to split at the inside seam. She read the local paper slowly, not from hope but from discipline. The notice was in the back, under county disposals, printed in type so plain it nearly disappeared. Joe Davies County Abandoned Structure Transfer. One condemned commercial outbuilding, former lithographic and job printing studio. Lower River District. Galena, Illinois. Purchaser assumes all risk. Taxes, remediation, repair, and removal obligations. Minimum transfer consideration. Applications close Friday at 4 p.m. Clara read it once. Then again, the word lithographic did not belong there, buried among notices for scrap fencing, a seized mower, and 2 lots of broken office furniture. It rose from the page like a voice spoken through a wall. She copied the notice onto the back of a library receipt with a pencil stub. Her hand remained steady until she reached the amount. $5. Not 500. Not 50. 5. The exact bill in her sock. She stayed in the chair until the radiator clicked off and the room began to cool. Around her, ordinary life continued with its faithful indifference. A boy whispered over homework. An older man read the sports section. A librarian pushed a cart between shelves, the wheels making a soft, repeating sound. Clara folded the receipt and placed it inside the envelope with the bill. She did not decide all at once. Decisions made too quickly had ruined enough things around her. She let the idea sit beside her like a stranger on a bench. By closing time, she knew only that she would walk past the county building before finding a place to sleep. Outside, Galena's streets climbed and fell in slopes that made the knees honest. The storefront windows glowed with warm displays meant for people who carried wallets, not satchels. There were antique shops, a bakery with sugared wreaths in the window, a hardware store closing its blinds, a cafe where someone had hung paper stars from fishing line. Clara moved through the light without entering it. At the corner, she saw the courthouse dome beyond bare branches, dark against a sky the color of pewter. The next morning would require the bill. It would require her name on a form. It would require saying yes to a building other people had measured and found worthless. She had said yes to less. A corner of a church pew. A dryer turning warm air into a temporary mercy. A muffin pressed into her hand by a woman who did not know her. A craft carried by a dead man in a folder now missing. That night she slept in a hay barn beyond the edge of town, with her satchel beneath her head and Elias's hat over her face to keep the dust from her mouth. Mice moved in the walls. Somewhere across the field, a freight train sounded low and patient along the river. The $5 envelope rested inside her coat. No longer only a boundary. No longer only a last defense against having nothing. Before the county doors opened, Clara would rise, brush hay from her skirt, and walk toward the abandoned studio whose dust had kept a secret longer than anyone had kept her. At first light, she rose before the horses began shifting in their stalls and shook the hay from her sleeves with two careful hands. The barn stood on a rise beyond the last row of houses, its boards gray with weather, its hinges furred with frost, and its rafters breathing out the dry smell of straw, dust, and animal heat. Clara had found it after dark by following a fence line until her legs would not argue with her any longer. She had asked no one's permission. She had left nothing behind except the pressed shape of her body in the hay. The thermometer nailed to a post near the door read 26 degrees. She looked at it because numbers steadied her. 26 meant pain in the fingers if she kept them bare too long. 26 meant the ditch water would wear a skin of ice. 26 meant she had to walk before the cold settled into her shoes and made her feet clumsy. The day before had been made of vehicles leaving her behind. The bus from the Iowa side had coughed into Illinois with only 4 passengers, its windows clouded by breath and road salt, and had let her off near the edge of town, where the driver said he was not allowed to make a special stop. From there she had walked a little over 3 miles along a shoulder made narrow by frozen weeds, then another mile through streets that rose so steeply she had to lean forward like a penitent. Her satchel strap had cut a groove into her coat. Twice she stopped to shift it. Twice she kept going. Now the town lay below the barn in a fold of morning smoke. Galena did not wake all at once. It stirred by increments. First a truck on a road below, then a porch light switching off, then a crow giving its plain opinion from the roof of a carriage house. Chimneys sent thin white lines into the air. The river, hidden by cottonwoods and warehouses, made itself known by a broad dampness that seemed to enter the bones of the brick buildings and remain there. She climbed down from the loft ladder, tested each rung before trusting her weight, and stepped outside. Frost silvered the weeds. Her breath moved ahead of her in small clouds. She put the brown felt hat low over her ears, crossed the field through a break in the fence, and took the road downhill toward town. By the time she reached the first storefronts, the sky had brightened to the color of milk in a blue bowl. The town's businesses stood close together as if for warmth. Kemp's Bakery had trays of cinnamon bread in the window and a girl in an apron shaking flour from a cloth. McAvoy Hardware sat farther down, its sign painted green with gold letters fading at the edges. A narrow place called River Bend Cafe showed 6 counter stools and a woman turning chairs from tabletops. Across the street, Heller's Antiques displayed oil lamps, washboards, and a dressmaker's dummy in a beaded collar. Near the corner, Haskins Pharmacy lit its front room 1 lamp at a time while an older man swept the threshold in slow half-moons. Clara passed each window without entering. Warmth had a way of asking for money. Smells did too. Coffee, yeast, floor wax, the buttery breath of dough rising behind glass. She kept to the outside edge of the sidewalk, where last night's sleet had dried into thin white seams between the bricks, and watched her own reflection move through the shop windows like a person already half absent. On Main Street, a deliveryman rolled a hand truck over iron cellar doors. The sound rang out sharply and then vanished between the buildings. 2 women in wool coats stood outside the cafe, speaking in low voices, their gloved hands wrapped around paper cups. A dog with white paws nosed at a newspaper box, then looked at Clara as if trying to place her. She looked away first. The county building stood uphill, as government buildings often do, as though paperwork preferred a view. She reached it by way of a stone stair that had been salted badly and still held slick places in the middle. At the top, she paused beneath a bare maple and rubbed feeling back into her fingers. The building before her was brick, square-shouldered, with tall windows, limestone trim, and a flag moving faintly in the cold. It had the look of a place that had said no to many people and considered this a form of order. Inside, the air changed. It smelled of radiator heat, old paper, damp wool, and furniture polish rubbed into wood by generations of public hands. A tiled hallway ran ahead of her with offices on either side, their doors lettered in black: recorder, assessor, treasurer, county clerk. Somewhere, unseen, a copier fed paper through itself with a soft mechanical sigh. A man in muddy boots studied a wall map. A woman with a toddler on her hip signed a form at a counter while the child stared solemnly at Clara's satchel. Clara wiped her shoes on the mat until there was no more mud to offer it. The clerk's office had a half door, a brass bell, and 2 tall file cabinets with drawers so deep they seemed capable of holding every mistake ever notarized in the county. A calendar from a farm supply company hung crooked above a row of mail slots. On the counter sat a glass jar full of dull pencils and a wooden tray marked applications. Behind the counter, a woman was standing at a high desk, pressing a stamp onto a stack of envelopes with the solemn rhythm of a person shelling peas. Her nameplate read MRS. Alma Kettering. She was perhaps 65, though her face had the clean severity of someone older and younger at once. Her hair was the color of iron filings, pinned in a coil at the back of her head. She wore a navy cardigan over a white blouse, and a chain held her spectacles around her neck when she was not using them. The skin of her hands was thin, finely lined, but the hands themselves were large and exact. Clara noticed hands. The woman lifted her eyes without lifting her chin. "May I help?" It was not shaped like a question, but Clara answered it as one. "I came about the abandoned structure transfer." "Mrs." Kettering's eyes moved from Clara's hat to her satchel, then to the hem of her coat, where barn dust still clung in pale streaks. She set the stamp down in its tray. "Which?" "The former lithographic studio. Lower River District." The clerk was still for a moment. Not surprised. Exactly. More as if a drawer had opened somewhere in her memory and she was waiting to see whether anything would fall out. "That notice closes today." "Yes, ma'am." "Applications require full assumption of liability." "Yes, ma'am." The woman looked toward the wall clock. It was not yet 9. "Come in. Then, shut the half door behind you." Clara did as she was told. The latch clicked softly, less final than the one she remembered from the porch, but close enough that her shoulders tightened. "Mrs." Kettering pulled a folder from a side shelf and laid it flat on the counter. The folder was buff-colored, softened at the corners, and tied with red string. On its tab, typed letters named the structure in language plain enough to seem almost tender: former print shop, Water Street rear lot. The clerk untied the string. "You understand," she began, and her voice carried the weight of words she had said before to people who had heard only what they wanted. "The county is not selling you a ready building." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no certificate of occupancy." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the roof is compromised, the rear foundation has shifted, and the chimney has not passed inspection since before I took this desk." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there may be lead paint, mold, animal damage, and old chemicals inside." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that if you sign, the demolition responsibility becomes yours unless the structure is brought into compliance." "Yes, ma'am." "Mrs." Kettering folded her hands on top of the file. Most people stop understanding right. Clara did not smile. Smiling would have looked like confidence, and she did not have any to spare. She placed both palms on the counter instead, partly to steady herself, and partly because Elias had taught her that a hand laid flat cannot pretend to be doing anything else. "I understand what the words mean," she said. "I do not know yet what the building means." The clerk studied her then, not kindly and not unkindly, but with the narrowed attention of a woman judging whether a seam would hold. After a moment, she opened the folder. There were maps, inspection sheets, photographs with curled edges, a tax record, a waiver, and 2 copies of a transfer deed. The photographs showed the studio from angles that did it no favors. A broken gutter, a boarded window, a roof line sagging at the rear corner, weeds high enough to hide whatever waited at the foundation. Clara looked at them without turning away. "Mrs." Kettering slid the waiver forward. "Read before signing." Clara read. The words were dense, exact, and chilly. She read every line because carefulness was the only wealth she had never fully lost. Hazard, indemnification, structural instability, environmental residue, public nuisance, demolition order suspended pending private transfer. She did not understand every legal turn, but she understood enough to know the county was washing its hands with soap already measured. Her fingers were stiff when she picked up the pen. It was tied to the counter with black string, its cap chewed flat by people who had stood where she was standing and left with licenses, permits, judgments, recorded births, recorded deaths, permission to build, proof of loss. She signed where Mrs. Kettering pointed. The first signature looked too narrow. The second steadier. The third, on the deed itself, seemed to enter the paper and remain. The clerk took the sheets, checked each line, then reached below the counter and lifted out a heavy brass stamp. It was not the little self-inking kind used for envelopes. This one had a handle darkened by decades of palms and a base that came down with ceremony. Mrs. Kettering aligned the deed beneath it, adjusted the corner by the width of a fingernail, and pressed. The sound was not loud, but it was absolute. Brass struck paper. Paper accepted the mark. She turned to the receipt book. Consideration received. Clara reached into her sock. She hated doing it in front of anyone, hated the exposure of poverty made physical. But there was nowhere else to hide what mattered. She removed the envelope, flattened it on the counter, and took out the single bill. It had gone soft at the creases. Mrs. Kettering did not look away, and because she did not look away, she did not make the act smaller or worse than it was. She took the bill, wrote a receipt, and placed the money in the drawer of her desk rather than the cash box. That small choice made Clara lift her eyes. "For the record," the clerk said. She tore the receipt along a metal edge and gave it across the counter. Then she opened a drawer and removed a ring with 2 keys on it. One was long and dark, the other newer, with a paper tag tied through its bow. The tag had faded almost blank. "The front door may or may not accept this one," she said. "If it does not, try lifting the door as you turn. The newer key is for the padlock on the alley gate. The alley is safer than the riverside." Clara closed her hand around the keys. They were colder than the room. Mrs. Kettering pulled a sheet of county stationery toward her and began drawing a map in pencil. "From here, take bench down to Green, then cross toward Commerce. Stay on the sidewalk where you can. Water Street runs behind the shops closer to the river. The studio is not on the tourist walk. You will pass a vacant coal office, a corrugated warehouse, and a walnut stand. When the pavement breaks, you are close. She marked the place with a square. Do not go through the river lot after rain. The ground gives. Yes, ma'am. And if you smell gas, leave at once. There is gas service. There was. I would not trust any pipe back there. The clerk tapped the pencil twice against the paper, then wrote a telephone number at the bottom. That is the building inspector's office. He is not quick, but he is honest. Those two qualities do not always live together. Clara folded the map along its margins and placed it with the receipt. She was turning toward the half door when Mrs. Kettering spoke again. Quieter. Whitcomb. Clara stopped. The clerk had the deed in her hand. Her spectacles were on now, low on her nose, and she was looking not at Clara's coat or satchel, but at the signed name. I knew a printer by that name, Mrs. Kettering said. Years ago. Clara kept her hand on the latch. The half-door trembled slightly under her fingers. He was my grandfather. The office seemed to draw in its breath. Mrs. Kettering set the deed down with care. He came here in 1989 to look at that building. Clara turned around fully. The clerk did not appear to enjoy delivering memories. She handled them like records, cautiously, aware that age could make paper brittle. It was already closed then. Not yet condemned, but close. He asked after ownership, asked whether any equipment remained, asked who held the tax liens. He had a notebook with him. Brown cover, elastic band. Clara could see the notebook without having seen that exact day. The pocket inside the front cover. The pencil worn flat on one side. The way he would have written the date first. Did he? No, Mrs. Kettering removed her spectacles and let them rest against her blouse. He came back twice. Then not again. There was no explanation in that. Only a gap. The clerk looked toward the window, where daylight touched the sill but did not warm it. He was a careful man. I remember careful people. They are rarer than loud ones. Clara's throat tightened, but she made no sound. On the counter between them lay the deed, the map, the key ring, the receipt, and a narrow bridge between what had been taken and what had waited. Mrs. Kettering opened the desk drawer again. Clara thought perhaps there was another form. Instead, the clerk took out the soft bill and smoothed it once with the side of her hand. She placed it beneath a metal paperweight shaped like a courthouse. I will enter it with the batch this afternoon, she said. It was a fiction. Maybe. Or a kindness wearing the plain clothes of procedure. Clara accepted it that way. Thank you. You need boots, Mrs. Kettering said. And food. I know that, too. The clerk's mouth moved almost toward a smile, but did not arrive there. Riverbend Cafe serves yesterday's rolls for less after 2. Ask for Doris. Do not tell her I sent you unless she charges full price. Clara nodded. It was all she could safely do. Outside, the morning had brightened and the town had become busier without becoming welcoming. She stood on the courthouse steps with the keys in one hand and the folded map in the other, while people went around her carrying errands, grudges, prescriptions, and cups of coffee. Something official had happened. Nothing visible had changed. She still had no bed, no wages, no address anyone would trust, and yet the county had written her name beside a building too ruined to want. She began walking. Bench Street gave her a view over rooftops and chimneys, then dropped her toward the more crowded slope of town. A man in a knitted cap lifted crates outside the bakery. The smell that came from within was nearly unbearable. She crossed at Green Street, waited for a pickup to pass, and followed the clerk's map downhill where the storefront backs grew plainer and the paint less tended. Behind the polished windows of Main Street lay the working side. Dumpsters, fire escapes, old loading doors, patched brick, grease-darkened vents, and stairs that went nowhere anyone invited visitors to see. On Commerce Street, the sidewalk narrowed beside a wall of limestone blocks blackened by time. A woman carrying a bag from the pharmacy glanced at Clara's satchel and then away. Near the cafe's rear entrance, a man in a white apron stepped outside to empty coffee grounds into a bin. Steam rose from the metal bucket and passed across Clara's face, warm for one brief second. She kept walking. Water Street ran low and uneven, closer to the river's damp breath. The pavement broke in places, giving way to gravel and old brick laid on edge. A vacant coal office stood where Mrs. Kettering said it would, with its windows painted over and a rusted scale platform sinking near the door. Beyond it was the corrugated warehouse, long and dull, rattling softly whenever wind moved along its side. A black dog lay in the shelter of a loading dock, head on paws, watching her approach. The dog did not bark at first. It only lifted its head. "Morning," Clara said. The dog considered this, rose stiffly, and followed her at a distance of 12 paces. It was large, old, and mostly shepherd, with one ear folded and a white muzzle. Every so often it stopped to sniff a tire or a clump of grass, then remembered her and came on. Clara did not try to pet it. Companionship offered too quickly can frighten a creature that has survived by distance. The walnut trees appeared beyond the warehouse, a stand of them along a lot where the ground dipped toward the river. Their branches were bare and black against the pale sky, twisting upward like hands that had worked too long in cold water. Husks from the fall lay flattened in the mud, staining it dark. Under the trees, a chain-link gate leaned inward, held by a padlock and a loop of wire. Behind the gate sat the studio. It was smaller than she expected and heavier in feeling. Not a house, not quite a shop, but a narrow brick work building set back from the road as if it had stepped away from attention. The front measured perhaps 22 feet across, the side wall nearer 40, with a single-story roof sloping toward the rear where the seam had failed. The bricks were a deep river red under soot and weather, laid in common bond, with limestone sills beneath windows boarded from the inside. At the front hung a sign so faded it could almost be mistaken for a scrap of wood. Whitcomb Daughters Lithographic. Most of the paint had lifted. The first word was ghostly. The ampersand remained stubborn. Daughters was easiest to read, perhaps because the board had been sheltered by the shallow porch roof, perhaps because some words refuse erasure more patiently than others. Clara stood outside the gate and did not move. The dog stopped beside the walnut tree and sat down. Above the front door, the roof sagged at the left corner where a gutter had torn free and hung like a broken arm. One chimney rose from the rear slope, square and soot-streaked, with 3 bricks missing near the cap. A cast-iron vent showed beneath the eave. The foundation was limestone, damp at the base, its mortar lost in places to powder and root. On the riverside, weeds had gone brown and stiff around 2 stacked pallets, a cracked stone trough, and what might once have been a coal chute. But the door was still there. It was wide enough for equipment, made of vertical planks crossed by 2 iron straps, its lower edge swollen from years of wet. Someone had nailed plywood over the upper glass. Someone else, longer ago, had painted the door a green now nearly black. The knob was brass, dulled by air but not gone. Clara took out the older key. Her fingers shook once. She closed them again until they steadied. Then she slid the key into the lock. It entered halfway and stopped. She lifted the door as the clerk had instructed. The key turned. Inside the building, something gave a long wooden sigh. The door opened only 8 inches before catching on the floor. Clara put her shoulder against it and pushed slowly, feeling the swollen bottom scrape across grit and fallen plaster. A wedge of dark widened. Air came out first, cold and dry, carrying the layered smell of dust, rain, mouse nests, old paper, metal, and something mineral she could not name until her body recognized it before her mind did. Stone. She stepped over the threshold. The front room was dim, but not blind. Light entered through breaks in the boards and made narrow ladders in the dust. Every movement disturbed the air. Particles rose and turned in the beams, slow as snow inside a jar. The floorboards under her shoes were wide pine, cupped with age, their seams black with old dirt. Near the front wall stood a counter built into the room itself, scarred by knives and ink tins, with pigeonholes above it for invoices or proofs. Most were empty. One held a curled envelope chewed at the corner. There was a smell of paper gone sour. Against the right wall, shelves sagged beneath ledgers, empty jars, and bundles of brittle rags tied with string. A stool lay on its side beneath the counter. In one corner stood a cast-iron stove with mica windows clouded over and a length of stovepipe running upward into a chimney hole packed badly with rags. Beside it rested a coal scuttle, half full of flakes that had once been fuel and were now mostly dust. Clara stood still until her eyes learned the room. The silence was not empty. It had layers. A drip somewhere toward the back. The faint tick of cooling metal, though nothing was warm. The scrape of a branch along the roof. The dog outside shaking its collar once. Beneath that, the deeper settled hush of a place not abandoned in a single day, but neglected through many, each day laying itself over the last. She set her satchel on the counter and listened to the floor before trusting it. One step. Then another. Near the middle, a board dipped. Near the stove, it held. At the rear of the front room, a wide opening without a door led into the workroom. The back room received less light. Its windows had been boarded more completely, and the roof failure showed there, in a dark stain that spread down one wall like spilled tea. The air was colder. The smell of stone grew stronger, joined now by rust, old grease, and the faint acid bite of something sealed long ago and not entirely spent. Clara waited at the threshold until the dim shapes separated themselves. A long workbench ran along the left wall, cluttered with useless remnants, a cracked brayer handle without its roller, a broken wooden tray, glass bottles filmed white inside, a bent measuring spoon, several tins with lids rusted shut. On the right stood a drying rack, its wooden slats warped but upright. Above it, hooks remained in the wall where tools had once hung. Their silhouettes were visible in the cleaner patches behind them.
Pale ghosts of absent things.
At the center of the room lay the press bed. The press itself was gone. The absence was so large that Clara understood at once where something valuable had been removed. Iron feet had once bolted into the floor. 4 dark squares marked the place. The planks around them were worn by years of stance and labor. Whoever had taken the press had left scars, washers, a snapped bolt, and a trail dragged through the dust toward the rear door. But beside that empty place, under a canvas blackened with soot, stood a limestone block on a low trestle. Clara did not touch it. She moved toward it with the care one gives an animal that might be sleeping. The canvas had stiffened with dust. Along one exposed edge, the stone showed pale cream gray, dense, fine-grained, its corners slightly rounded from use. It was larger than her grandfather's stones had been, perhaps 3 feet by 4, thick as a family Bible stood on end, and far heavier than anything one person could move without machinery. Her breath caught, not because it was beautiful in any ordinary way, but because it had remained. One stone. At least one. She kept her hands at her sides. The first rule was never to touch a prepared surface without knowing what lived there. Even abandoned, even dirty, even in a condemned building, the stone deserved a moment of recognition before use, before salvage, before need. A drop fell somewhere behind the wall. She turned to the rest of the room. There was a rear door with a newer padlock on the inside hasp, odd and useless from within. There was a small wash sink beneath a broken window, dry now, with a brown stain beneath the faucet. There were 2 cabinets, one closed, one hanging open. The open one held mouse droppings, scraps of paper, and a nest made partly from shredded invoices. The closed one had a porcelain knob shaped like a button. Clara did not open it that first hour. The body can receive only so much arrival at once. She went back to the front room, dragged the fallen stool upright, tested it, and sat. Dust rose around her shoes. Through the crack beneath the door, daylight lay in a thin line across the floor. Her hands were black at the fingertips from touching the door. The counter, the map, the key. She rubbed them together and smelled rust. Hunger arrived after stillness did. She had eaten nothing since the clementine peel she chewed the previous afternoon for want of sweetness. There was no food in the satchel except a corner of cracker wrapped in paper, softened by damp. She ate it slowly while sitting behind the counter, as if she were a clerk of something no one had visited in years. The dog scratched once at the door. Clara opened it enough to look out. It stared at her, then lay down under the porch roof with its back to the wind. "Suit yourself," she said. Her voice sounded too large in the room. The afternoon passed in small permissions. She opened the front windows from the inside only enough to let stale air move. She found a broom without most of its bristles and swept a square near the stove. She carried 3 dead birds, light as paper, outside and buried them beneath walnut leaves with a piece of broken slate. She discovered that the ceiling leak was not actively dripping because the day was too cold for melt. She found an outhouse behind the warehouse, leaning but usable if approached respectfully. She found no running water. Toward evening, she walked back to town with the keys in her pocket and the dog following until the edge of Commerce Street, where it stopped as if some private boundary had been reached. At Riverbend Cafe, she stood near the door long enough for the woman behind the counter to say, without looking up, "Either come in or close it. Heat costs." Clara came in. The woman was stout, with flour on one sleeve and hair the color of wet sand pinned under a red scarf. This had to be Doris, though Clara did not use the name at first. The cafe smelled of coffee, onions, yeast, and the sweet exhaustion of a room that had fed workers since dawn. There were photographs of floodwater on one wall, a deer calendar near the register, and a corkboard crowded with business cards, church suppers, lost cats, and notices for firewood. "Yesterday's rolls," Clara said. "If you have any." The woman looked at her then. Not quickly, not softly, fully. "2 for $1 after 2, she said. Clara counted coins on the counter. The woman put 3 rolls in a paper bag, then added a heel of butter in wax paper with the deliberate air of someone correcting an inventory error. "You from the county office." Clara froze. "That coat has courthouse dust," the woman said. "Different from road dust." Clara did not know whether this was a joke, so she only said, "I signed for the print building." The cafe went on around them. A spoon against a cup. A man clearing his throat in a booth. The low murmur of two women near the window. Doris folded the bag top twice. "That place has needed a body inside it for a long while. I do not know if I am enough of one." Doris pushed the bag closer. "Nobody is." At first. Clara carried the rolls back before full dark. The dog joined her at the same corner and escorted her to the gate as though this had been arranged. She tried the alley padlock, opened it, and secured it behind her with more confidence than she felt. The studio's front room had grown colder in her absence. Shadows pooled beneath the counter and in the corners where shelves leaned toward surrender. She chose the place where the floor held firm near the stove. There was no firewood, and she did not trust the chimney. She did not trust the stovepipe. The rags, the old ash, or the dark hole above it. So she kept her coat on, wrapped the satchel strap around her wrist, and prepared to sleep as she had slept elsewhere, with one ear awake. First, she made the room smaller. She moved 2 crates to block the worst draft under the door. She shook dust from a canvas remnant and laid it on the floor, then put her spare shirt over it, then Elias's hat folded beneath her cheek. She placed the key ring inside her blouse, where metal cooled against skin until it warmed. She ate 1 roll in narrow bites and saved the other 2. Butter made her eyes close for a moment, not from feeling but from the body's simple recognition of fat and salt. Outside, night took the river district without ceremony. The town above kept its lights longer. Through cracks in the boards, Clara could see faint bands of yellow from distant windows and the occasional sweep of headlights along the warehouse wall. Somewhere uphill, laughter broke from a doorway and was cut off by closing glass. A train moved across the river with a deep iron breathing. The dog settled under the porch, circled 3 times, and dropped with a sigh that came through the door more clearly than any human comfort would have. Inside, the studio cooled further. Cold entered first through the floor, then the shoulders, then the jaw. Clara tucked her hands beneath her arms and stared toward the rear opening, where the workroom waited in a darker rectangle. She could not see the stone now. She knew where it was. That was enough. The building made sounds around her, none of them dramatic, all of them exact, a rafter shifting as the temperature fell, a strip of loose flashing ticking lightly, the settling pop of old wood, the faint skitter of a mouse along the wall and gone. She had slept in public places where every sound was a warning. This was different. Not safe. Not yet, but enclosed. The danger had edges she could learn. Before sleep took her, she reached into the satchel and removed the receipt. She unfolded it by touch, though there was too little light to read. The paper was proof that some forgotten office drawer now held her name beside a thing nobody else had wanted. It was also proof that wanting and owning were not the same. Ownership had signatures. Wanting had weather. She folded the receipt along its crease and placed it under the hat. Her last waking sensation was the mineral smell from the back room, faint and steady beneath the dust, as if a buried craft had breathed once after a long restraint. The studio had been waiting, and so had she. On the first morning, Clara found the well by following the dog. It had been hidden behind the walnut stand, not far from the alley gate, where the weeds had flattened under their own winter weight and the ground dipped toward a line of willows. The dog led her there without ceremony. Nose down, tail level, pausing once to look back as if to make certain she possessed enough sense to notice what was being shown. The well was covered by a square of weathered boards weighed with 2 stones. A rusted hand pump stood beside it, its handle tied down with baling wire gone gray from years of weather. She did not drink from it. That much caution had survived every hunger. She cut the wire with a dull pocket knife from her satchel, lifted the handle, and worked it slowly until the pump gave a dry cough. Then a second one, then a thread of brown water that spat into the weeds and vanished. She pumped until her shoulder burned. After several minutes the water ran clearer. Though still with a mineral taste, she tested only against her lip. She filled a cracked jar she had found in the front room, let it settle, and made a mark on the label with pencil. Well water. Not yet trusted. By mid-morning, she had located the outhouse properly. It leaned behind the warehouse near a thicket of sumac, its door held shut by a loop of wire and its roof patched with tar paper. Inside, a wasp nest slept in one corner, abandoned or waiting for weatherkinder to wings. Clara swept the seat with a bundle of dry grass, tested the floor with her heel, and hung a strip of cloth over a broken seam for privacy. It was not dignity, but it was order, and order had to begin somewhere. The first 3 days did not improve the studio. They only introduced her to it. She learned that the 3rd board inside the front door complained underweight, but the 5th board gave no warning and dipped sharply enough to twist an ankle. She learned that the counter was fastened into brick with square nails and could be trusted as a brace. She learned that rainwater entered through the roof seam, ran down the rear wall, followed a crack in the plaster, and dropped onto the same place every time, where someone long before her had set a galvanized basin. She learned that mice used the north shelf as a road, and that one corner behind the stove belonged to a spider so pale it seemed made of cellar dust. She made a map on the back of the county directions. Not a pretty map. A useful one. Soft floor. Nail heads. Leak path. Stove danger. Workroom safe route. Cabinet unopened. Stone. Rear door swollen. Possible chimney blockage. She marked each discovery because fear shrank when given names, and because Elias had taught her that the first work of restoration was not repair, but attention. At night, she slept in the same cleared square near the stove, wrapped in her coat with her satchel against her ribs. The dog, who did not offer a name and therefore did not receive one, remained on the porch most nights. On the second evening, she placed half a roll near the threshold. He sniffed it, looked offended by pity, and ate it only after she closed the door. On the 3rd morning, frost covered the inside of the front window boards in a lace so fine it seemed deliberate. Clara woke with her jaw aching and her hands tucked under her collar. She could not live long inside a building without heat. She knew this plainly, without drama. Cold was not an enemy that needed hatred. It was a fact that required method. So she went to McAvoy Hardware. The bell above the door gave a tired ring when she entered, and warmth met her first. Then the smell of kerosene, oiled metal, leather gloves, seed packets, rope, and dust swept into corners but never fully defeated. The store was deeper than it looked from the street. Shelves rose nearly to the pressed tin ceiling, crowded with hinge bins, nails sold by the pound, storm lanterns, stovepipe elbows, enamel pails, paintbrushes wrapped in brown paper, glass knobs, hand saws, mousetraps, and jars of screws sorted with a care that made Clara feel less alone. Behind the counter stood a man with one shoulder lower than the other and a white beard trimmed close to his jaw. He wore a green canvas apron marked by years of pencil lines and pipe ash. His left eye had a pale cast to it, Not blind but clouded. And when he looked at Clara, the good eye did the measuring while the other seemed fixed on some private distance. "Morning," he said. His name was stitched on the apron in yellow thread, H. Lutz. Clara placed the chimney sketch on the counter along with a list she had written the night before. She had written it twice, removing anything that belonged to comfort rather than necessity. The man turned the paper toward himself with 2 fingers. "You are the girl in the print shop." Clara did not ask how he knew. Towns that size carried news without appearing to carry it. "I need to make the stove safe enough for a small fire." He read the list slowly. His lips moved once at the word creosote. "You ever cleaned a—" "No, sir." "You ever taken apart stovepipe?" "No, sir." "You ever made a fire in a—" "Yes, sir." "Not one that has been asleep that long." That made him look at her more directly. "Good." He came around the counter, walking with a slight drag in his right foot, and led her to the back wall where brushes hung from hooks. He took down one round chimney brush, 6 inches wide, stiff wire bristles, and held it up. "Too wide, unless your pipe is bigger than it looks." She showed him the sketch. He selected a smaller one, 5-inch, threaded. "You need rods, not rope, unless you like trouble falling on your face." He began placing items on the counter with the calm of a surgeon setting instruments beside a patient. A 5-inch wire chimney brush, 3 fiberglass rods, 4 feet each, a flat blade screwdriver, a cold chisel, a small wire hand brush, 2 dust masks sealed in paper, a pair of leather gloves from a sale bin, black furnace cement in a half-pint tub, a roll of foil tape, a stove thermometer, a box of wooden matches, a galvanized ash bucket with a lid that did not fit perfectly but would do. Clara watched the pile grow and felt each item turning into money she did not have. "Mr. Lutz saw it before she spoke. "You got an—" "No, sir." "You got work." "Not yet." "You got the building." "Yes, sir." He leaned his elbows on the counter. The apron creased across his stomach. "Then you have collateral nobody wants and trouble everybody can see." Clara waited. The store clock ticked behind him. Somewhere in the aisle, a furnace clicked on and sent warm air through a floor grate. "I can open a 30-day account," he said. "Small limit. You pay what you can every Friday. If you vanish, I will be irritated, not ruined. I do not know if I can pay by Friday. Then you come say so by Friday." She looked at the tools, then at his hands. They were square and cracked at the knuckles, with a half-moon scar across the back of one thumb. "Why would you—" "Mr. Lutz took a pencil from behind his ear. "Because a chimney fire will take half that row if you guess wrong." That was not charity, at least not in clothing Charity usually wore. It was civic caution. It was also mercy, exact enough to be accepted. He wrote her name on a card and slid it into a metal file box behind the register. The prices were marked beside each item. Chimney brush, $9.75. Rods, 3 at 4.20 each. Gloves, $3. Dust masks, $1 and cents for 2. Wire brush, 2.45. Furnace cement, 5.85 cents. Foil tape, 4.60 cents. Screwdriver, 2.95. Cold chisel, $3.50. Matches, 65 cents. Stove thermometer, 7.25. Ash bucket, $6.40. Total, Before tax, $59.10. The number landed like a stone in water. Mr. Lutz wrote it on the account card anyway. Then he reached below the counter and pulled out a stapled booklet with a faded blue cover. The title read Safe Repair of Stoves, Flues, and Small Chimneys for Homeowners. University Extension Service, revised 1986. A coffee ring browned the lower corner. This is free. Clara took it carefully. Read the chimney section twice, he said. Then read it again when you think you understand it. I will. Do not use water on a chimney fire unless somebody you dislike is standing under the brick. She looked up. His face remained steady. That was not permission to have one. No, sir. He wrapped the brush in paper so the wire would not tear her coat and tied the rods with twine. When she lifted the bundle, it was awkward, and he came around to adjust the balance against her shoulder. Work from the bottom first, he said. Do not climb that roof. Not yet. The walk back took longer because the rods knocked against her leg, and the ash bucket bumped her knee with every step. The dog met her at the walnut stand, sniffed the furnace cement, and sneezed. Clara set the supplies inside the front room and spent the rest of the morning reading by the best light. She read the chimney chapter 3 times. The first time, she understood the warnings. The second, she understood the sequence. The third, she began to trust the work enough to begin. She laid every tool on the counter in the order needed. She tied a cloth over her hair. She put on the leather gloves, then removed them so she could feel the screws, then put them on again when soot bit under her nails. The stovepipe came apart grudgingly. 2 screws turned with the screwdriver. 1 stripped. She used the cold chisel to bite a slot across its head, tapped it with the hammer she had found in the workroom cabinet, and turned it 1/4 inch at a time. When the elbow loosened, a black fall of soot poured into the ash bucket and onto her boots. She stood back until the dust settled. The smell was sharp and greasy, the smell of many fires that had burned damp coal or green wood and left their memory in layers. Creosote had glazed the inside of the pipe. Not thick everywhere, but enough to shine in ridges like black varnish. In the vertical run above the stove, flakes had loosened and collected near the bend. Clara brushed the pipe outdoors first, scraping until her wrists ached, catching the debris in a torn feed sack. She wore the dust mask. It helped less than she wished. Soot entered at the edges, settled on her eyelashes, found the lines beside her nose. The chimney throat was worse. She worked from below, as Mr. Lutz had told her, taping a cloth around the hearth opening to make a rough curtain and feeding the brush upward 1 rod at a time. Push. Twist clockwise. Pull slightly. Push again. Add rod. Repeat. At 4 feet, the brush struck a blockage. She did not force it. She lowered it, tapped the rod to shake debris, raised it again, and worked the bristles in patient circles until something above gave way. A shower of creosote flakes dropped behind the cloth, then a small bird nest, dry and matted with twine. She carried the nest outside in the ash bucket and stood for a minute in the cold air, coughing into her sleeve. Then she went back in. For 6 hours, she worked in intervals of 20 minutes because her shoulders could not manage longer. She brushed upward through the throat, then from the clean-out door at the chimney base, then upward again. She used the wire hand brush on the damper edge until bare metal showed in places. She scraped soot from the stove's firebox, removed a cracked fire brick, turned it, and set it back where the break would not take direct flame. She sealed 1 gap in the pipe with furnace cement, not beautifully, but fully. She used foil tape only where the booklet permitted it, then wrote on the margin, "Tape not for hot joints." By dusk, she had filled the ash bucket twice. Her face in the small remaining mirror behind the counter looked like a stranger printed in charcoal. Only the skin around her eyes remained pale where the mask had pressed. She laughed once, silently, not from amusement but from surprise that a person could become so visibly marked by trying to make a room safe. She waited until the next afternoon for the first fire. Waiting was part of the work. The cement needed time. The pipe joints needed rechecking in daylight. The chimney needed one more brush pass, and Clara needed the courage that came from repetition rather than hope. She found dry sticks beneath the warehouse overhang, thin and gray, and broke them over her knee. From the walnut stand she gathered only fallen deadwood, none thicker than her thumb. For tinder, she used paper from a mouse-chewed ledger whose numbers had faded beyond use. She set the stove thermometer on top. Then she built the smallest fire she could. Paper. Splinters. 2 twigs crossed. Match touched to edge. Door left open 1 inch for draft. At first, smoke hesitated. It rolled once toward the room, and Clara's whole body tightened. Then the chimney took hold with a faint upward pull. The smoke narrowed, straightened, and vanished into the pipe. The twigs caught. The stove made a small ticking sound as iron accepted heat after years of cold. Clara crouched before it without moving. A first fire in an untrusted stove is less a comfort than a conversation. The iron asked whether she had cleaned enough. The pipe asked whether its seams were sealed. The chimney asked whether its long throat remembered how to draw. Clara watched the joints for smoke. She smelled the air for hidden heat. She touched the floorboards near the hearth, then the wall behind the pipe, then the brick around the thimble, and waited. Nothing flared. Nothing leaked. After 30 minutes, she added 1 larger stick. The thermometer climbed slowly. 100. 150. 200. She kept it below 300, as the booklet advised for a cautious first burn. The room did not become warm all at once. It softened. The cold lifted first from the air near her knees, then from the counter, then from the breath she took. That evening, she made her first hot meal in the studio. It was not a grand meal. A tin cup of water brought from the cafe after Doris allowed her to fill it without discussion. A handful of oats bought on account from the hardware store's grocery shelf for 49 cents. A pinch of salt from a paper packet saved from the mission. She set the cup on the stove's warmer plate and watched steam gather beneath the rim. When the oats thickened, she ate with a spoon cleaned in cold water and wiped on her sleeve. The dog received the scrapings after they cooled. He accepted them with solemn restraint. Heat changed the building that night. Not greatly. Not enough to make it hospitable. But enough to reveal another range of sounds, the expansion of pipe, the settling of brick, the drip from the roof stain, turning slow as ice loosened, the faint dry crackle of soot flakes somewhere high in the chimney after the fire died down. Clara stayed awake until the stove was cold enough to trust. Then she slept longer than she had slept since the porch locked behind her. The next morning, she began the inventory of the workroom. She did it as Elias would have done, though with poorer paper and no proper pencil sharpener. She divided the page into columns: object, condition, use, danger. She swept only enough space to walk, because dust itself could hold evidence of what had been moved. She did not begin with the stone. She began at the door and worked clockwise. On the left wall, the long bench proved sound at one end and weak at the other. Its surface held knife cuts, ink stains, ring marks from jars, and one shallow burn in the shape of a tipped match. Under it she found a wooden drawer full of hardened rubber bands, rusted pen nibs, brass thumbtacks, 3 printer's coins, a broken awl handle, and a folded scrap listing ink colors in a hand not Elias's. Lamp black, bone black, Prussian blue, vermilion, use sparing, chrome yellow, poison, burnt umber, transparent lake. She copied the list. The shelves above held bottles. Gum arabic, dried into amber glass at the bottom. Turpentine, empty but still sharp enough to announce itself when she lifted the lid. Asphaltum varnish, sealed and dangerous. Nitric acid bottle, stoppered. Residue only, marked with 3 red crosses. She did not move that one far. She set it in a crate by itself and wrote Ask R. Lutz. The drying rack had 24 slots, 16 intact. In 3 of them lay prints spoiled by water, their paper fused and feathered. She lifted one gently and saw part of a riverboat. The paddle wheel clear, the rest lost to mildew. Another held the corner of a seed advertisement. Another, only a woman's gloved hand holding a spray of wheat. Not valuable, she supposed. Still, they were marks made by hands that had stood in this room and believed the impression worth pulling. She hung them on a line near the stove to dry, not to save them fully, but to keep them from further harm. In the clothes cabinet, after she worked the porcelain knob for several minutes, she found aprons folded around nothing, 2 cracked glass palettes, a jar of greasy lithographic crayons hardened but not destroyed, 3 sponges dry as husks, and 1 leather roller ruined by mice. Beneath the bottom shelf lay a folded length of muslin. Inside it were small limestone samples, hand-sized, numbered in pencil along the edges. Practice stones. Clara touched those first, because they were already marred, already meant for learning. She did not touch the large block until afternoon. Before approaching it, she swept around the trestle and cleaned her hands. The canvas over the stone had to be lifted, but it had stiffened over decades and stuck along one corner where roof water had carried soot into the fibers. She eased it free inch by inch. Dust rolled across the surface and spilled to the floor. When the canvas came away, the limestone emerged fully into the dim room. It was not blank. There were faint traces on the upper surface. Not enough to print, perhaps, but enough to reveal the ghost of a design. A border of leaves, lettering too worn to read, and in the center what might have been a woman seated beside a press. Clara bent close, breathing through her mouth so she would not disturb the surface. The stone was cold enough that her breath clouded above it. Its edges had been beveled by use. One corner bore a pencil mark. No. 7. On the near side, 3 shallow gouges crossed the stone, damage from careless movement or perhaps a tool dropped long ago. The trestle beneath was oak, heavy, bolted at the corners, with cross braces darkened by oil. It seemed too strong for the room around it. Clara wrote Stono. 7. Larg. Image trace. Do not clean yet. Then she noticed the sound. Not at first. At first, there was only the ordinary silence of her work and the stove cooling behind her. She leaned one hand on the trestle and shifted her weight. The wood answered with a dull complaint. But beneath it, or within it, came a second note, faintly hollow and delayed. She straightened. She pressed again, this time on the opposite corner. Solid. She pressed near the front. Solid. She pressed the rear left corner. There it was again. A low, wooden absence underweight. Clara stood still. A hollow sound in a building full of rot did not mean treasure. It could mean a void where support had failed. It could mean animals. It could mean water had eaten what should have remained. She had learned not to let wanting run ahead of evidence. She took the hammer from the counter, wrapped its head in cloth, and tapped lightly along the trestle legs. Oak answered oak. She tapped the floorboards around it. Wide pine, dull and dry. She tapped the crossbrace beneath the stone. At the rear left, the note changed. She crouched and looked under the trestle. Dust hung in thick ropes from the underside. A spiderweb crossed one brace like a torn veil. The floorboards beneath the trestle were not like the surrounding boards. They had been cut shorter, their ends hidden beneath the frame. 4 square pegs held a panel in place, nearly invisible under grime. At the center of the panel was a round disc the size of a silver dollar, made not of pine but cedar, its grain tight and reddish where dust had chipped away. She brushed it with her sleeve. The cedar disc had no nail slot, no ring, no hinge, only a tiny drilled hole at one edge, too small for a finger, large enough perhaps for a pin or awl. Clara inserted the broken awl handle from the drawer. It did not fit. She tried a nail. Too thick. She found a printer's bodkin among the nibs, rusted but slender. The point entered the hole and caught. The disc turned a 1/4 inch, then stopped. She did not force it. Instead, she examined the panel. The stone above was impossible to move, but perhaps it did not need moving. The compartment, if it was a compartment, had been made beneath the trestle, using the weight of the block as its guard. Whoever had hidden it had known that thieves take portable things first. A press could be dragged away. Rollers could be boxed. Stones could be sold or shattered. But a limestone block weighing hundreds of pounds, on a trestle built like a bridge, would be left to dust and inconvenience. Clara tried the disc again, this time pressing inward as she turned. A soft click came from the panel. 1 square peg lifted by the width of a fingernail. Her hands went cold despite the room's modest warmth. She marked the position with pencil. Then she lifted the peg carefully with the bodkin, set it aside, and found that the other 3 pegs were not structural at all. They were covers. Beneath each lay a brass screw head darkened almost black. The screws had not been turned in many years. She fetched the flat-blade screwdriver, cleaned each slot with the bodkin, and pressed down hard before turning so she would not strip them. The first screw resisted, then surrendered with a small cry. The second came easier. The third broke loose all at once and skinned her knuckle against the wood. She wrapped the cut in cloth and continued. When the 4th screw came free, the panel did not fall. It held, sealed by age. Clara slid the cold chisel into the narrow seam, not prying hard, only inviting air into a place that had forgotten it. Dust lifted. Something inside gave the faint scent of cedar and paper. The panel opened downward on hidden hinges. Behind it was darkness, and within the darkness, bundles wrapped in oilcloth. Clara did not reach in immediately. She sat back on her heels and breathed until her hands belonged to her again. There are moments when discovery is too large for the body that finds it, and the only honest response is delay. She went to the front room, checked the door, checked the stove, looked through the crack at the porch where the dog slept with his nose under his tail, and returned with the lantern she had bought on account that morning for $3, after Mr. Lutz agreed the store could survive one more line on her card. The lantern light entered the compartment gently. There were 5 packages, 3 long, flat bundles wrapped in oilcloth and tied with linen tape. 1 narrow wooden case, cedar like the disc. One square tin box with a hinged lid and no label. Behind them, tucked against the far wall, lay a roll of paper in a sealed tube in a cloth pouch gone green at the drawstring where metal had touched it. Clara removed the first flat bundle and laid it on the workbench. The oilcloth cracked along the fold but held. She untied the linen tape rather than cutting it. Inside lay prints, each separated by tissue browned at the edges. She lifted the top sheet with both hands. It showed the studio. Not as it stood now, but as it had been, clean brick, front windows bright. The sign legible. 2 women standing in the doorway, wearing long skirts and aprons, one with a roller held upright like a staff. The line work was delicate, the shadows deliberate. At the bottom, in pencil, was written trial proof, June 1903. Clara set it down and covered it again. Not because it was unimportant. Because it was. The second and third bundles held more prints. River packets at the landing. A catalog cover for a seed company. A portrait of a woman in profile, her hair pinned high, her expression exact and unsmiling. A sheet of botanical studies so finely drawn that every vein in the leaves appeared patient. Some were signed with names Clara did not know. Some bore the same mark in the corner, a small ampersand inside a square. In the cedar case were tools. Not many. Only those small enough to hide and valuable enough to keep from dispersal. 2 lithographic crayons wrapped in waxed paper. Scraper with an ebony handle worn smooth by use. A brass grease pencil holder. A sponge knife. A tiny glass bottle of powdered rosin sealed with wax. 3 paper packets labeled with pigment names. A palette knife thin as a leaf. At the bottom lay a folded apron, child-sized or merely made for a narrow woman, its bib marked with black fingerprints that had outlived the hand. The cloth pouch held coins. She opened it last among the small things, before the tin box, because coins made a plain kind of sense and her mind needed plainness. Inside were silver dollars, half-dollars, quarters, and several gold coins wrapped in squares of cloth. Morgan silver dollars, their dates ranging from the 1880s into the early years of the next century. Walking Liberty halves. Barber quarters. 5 Indian head half-eagles. 2 St. Gaudens double eagles, warm even in lantern light. There were also pennies, dark Indian heads and wheat cents, perhaps kept not for value but for date, for witness. The tin box was heavier than its size allowed. Clara set it on the bench and lifted the latch. It opened with no lock, only resistance from age. Inside were paper packets, a leather envelope, and banknotes bound in flat bundles with cotton tape. The top packet contained a medal wrapped in blue cloth. She unfolded the cloth and found a bronze cross with a ribbon faded nearly colorless. On the back, engraved in a small plain hand, were a name and a year, 1918. She did not yet know whose name it was. She placed the medal beside the lamp. Then she counted. Not quickly. Not with greed. Counting was a form of care. It was also a way to keep from being overcome by what the tin box meant. She cleaned the workbench first, laid down muslin, and made columns. Banknotes. Gold. Silver. Small coin. Documents. She wrote each amount before moving to the next, checking twice, then covering each stack with cloth. The banknotes were mostly older issues, some worn thin, some crisp where they had slept untouched. Tens, 20s, 50s, 100s, startling in their calmness. The gold coins she valued at their marked denomination first, not their collector's worth, because she needed one number and then another later. The silver dollar she counted by face value, stacking them in careful towers of 10. The smaller coins she sorted by type and date until her back ached and the lantern flame trembled in its chimney. When she finished the first count, she did not trust it. She counted again. $38,000.74 in face value lay on the bench and in the open tin, not including the prints, tools, stone, or whatever worth time had given the coins beyond their stamped promise. $38,074. Clara wrote the number, then set the pencil down. The room had not changed. The roof still failed. The floor still dipped. The stove still required caution. The well remained untested. The outhouse leaned. The county paperwork held its warnings, and her account at McAvoy Hardware had already become a debt. Yet on the bench before her lay more money than she had ever seen, hidden by hands that had trusted weight, cedar, screws, and patience to outlast thieves and weather alike. She did not touch it for several minutes. The dog scratched once at the front door. A car passed somewhere beyond the warehouse, tires hissing on damp pavement. Water moved in the river, broad and unseen. Then Clara noticed the leather envelope beneath the last packet. It was flat, dark brown, tied with thread. Across the front, in ink faded to tea color, someone had written, "To the one who opens this when the house has no witness left." She did not open it. Her hand rose toward the thread and stopped before touching it. The room was too dim, her body too tired, the discovery too newly alive. Some words deserve mourning. Some inheritances should not be read with soot on the face and hunger turning the mind thin. Elias had never opened a new packet of paper under poor light. He had waited for the right surface, the right air, the right hand. So Clara placed the envelope back in the tin box, not under the money but beside the metal. She rewrapped the coins, rebound the notes, covered the prints with their oilcloth, and returned nothing yet to the compartment. Instead, she arranged the packages on the bench in the order found and pulled the stool close. She would sit awake if she had to. She did not trust the world enough to sleep with the compartment open, and she did not trust her shaking hands enough to seal it again in haste. After a while, the room became too small for breathing. She took the lantern and went outside. Night had settled over the lower river district with a cold, damp patience. The warehouse wall stood blank beside her. The walnut branches held the sky in black lines. The dog rose, stretched, and followed her to the edge of the lot, where the ground sloped toward the water. She did not go far. Mrs. Kettering's warning about the river lot remained with her. She stopped where the weeds thinned, and she could see a strip of water between trunks. The Galena River moved without caring what had been found. Its surface carried a weak shine from town lights and a duller shine from the clouded moon. Along the far bank, reeds shivered. Somewhere upstream, a loose chain struck metal again and again, made small by distance. Clara stood with the lantern low at her side and watched the water take the night piece by piece. She did not plan. Not repairs, not repayment, not escape. Planning would come later and would need daylight, paper, advice, and restraint. For that hour, she let the fact remain only a fact. Something had been kept, and she had found it. Not earned in the usual way. Not stolen. Not granted by family. Not given with a smile that could later be withdrawn. Kept. The word entered her with more force than money. Kept was different from saved. Saved could happen by accident, by fear, by forgetting. Kept meant intention. Kept meant somebody had closed the cedar disc, tightened the screws, wrapped the prints, folded the bills, and believed that a future hand might be honest enough to open them slowly. Clara looked back toward the studio. From outside, with one lantern burning in the workroom, the broken building seemed less abandoned than occupied by a single ember. The sign above the door could not be read in the dark, but she knew where the word Daughters was, sheltered under the shallow porch roof, patient against weather. She stayed until the cold moved through her coat. Then she returned to the workroom, set the lantern on the bench beside the unopened letter, and sat with the packages until dawn began making the window boards gray. The studio had been waiting, and so had she. Morning came through the boarded windows in pale pieces, and Clara waited until every piece had settled before touching the leather envelope. The workroom had cooled during the night. The stove in the front room held only a gray memory of heat, and her fingers had stiffened around the pencil she must have kept in her hand after the last count. On the bench before her, the packages remained in their careful order. Oilcloth, cedar, tin, metal, coins under muslin, prints covered against dust. The envelope lay beside them, tied with thread so fine it seemed unlikely to have survived a single hard pull, much less decades of waiting. She washed her hands first. The water from the jar had cleared overnight, leaving a faint brown sediment at the bottom. She poured the upper portion into a chipped basin, rubbed her fingers without soap, and dried them on the least dirty corner of her shirt. Then she opened the front door to let in a little air. The dog lifted his head from the porch boards, examined her, and returned his nose to his paws. The world had gone on without asking what had happened inside the studio. Clara returned to the bench. Only then did she recognize the handwriting. Not Elias's. The slant was different, the letters narrower, with long descenders and a formal capital W that curled back on itself like a shaving of wood. But the discipline of it struck her in the body. Each word had been placed, not merely written. Each line kept its distance from the next. Whoever had written it had respected paper as a surface worthy of restraint. She untied the thread by loosening the knot with the bodkin. She did not break it. The flap lifted with a dry whisper, and inside lay 8 folded sheets. Cream-colored, lined faintly in blue, filled front and back in the same exact hand. Along the original creases, the paper had darkened. Clara unfolded the pages on the muslin, weighting the corners with 2 silver dollars and the small brass scraper from the cedar case. The first line weighted at the top as if it had been written that morning. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the stone has done the last of its guarding, and the hands that hid these things are all dust, or near enough to dust for the difference not to matter. I have no way of knowing your name. I do not know whether you come from our blood, our craft, or only from need. Need is a lawful heir in its own way. If you open the compartment carefully, then I trust you more than I would trust a title, and more than I would trust a man with a receipt. I am writing because Dr. Samuel B., keen at Mercy Hospital in Dubuque, has told me the word I had been waiting for him not to say. Carcinoma of the lung, advanced, with little to be done except laudanum when the pain takes my breath and rest when rest will still have me. He was gentle. I do not hold that against him. I came home by train the same afternoon and unlocked the shop before going upstairs, because some news must be brought first to the place where one's life has been spent. My name is Adelaide Margarethe Whitcomb, born Adelaide Steinmetz in Galena in 1891, daughter of Johanna Steinmetz Whitcomb, born in Solnhofen, Bavaria, in 1866, and Thomas Whitcomb, born near Mineral Point, Wisconsin, in 1861. My grandmother was Elise Bauer Steinmetz, born in 1840 in Eichstätt, who learned stone from her father before she learned English, and my great-grandfather was Matthias Bauer, born in 1812, a quarry cutter and printer's helper in the limestone country where the best stones were pulled from the earth like sleeping tables. He carried no stone across the ocean, but he carried the recipes in his head and the stubbornness in his wrists. That proved lighter and lasted longer. Thomas Whitcomb opened this shop in 1887 with Johanna at the graining table. Though the sign painter charged him extra for the words "and daughters" and told him no man would order printing from a shop that admitted women knew the work. My mother made him pay the extra. She said hiding a true thing costs more in the end. We printed billheads for merchants, labels for flour sacks, maps for mine offices, church concert notices, wedding portraits, seed catalog covers, and once, for 3 months, wrappers for a patent medicine that smelled of anise and dishonesty. We worked with what came. That is the habit of any honest shop. The trade closed for us on October 29, 1929. I write the date plainly because some dates deserve to be pinned down like cloth before cutting. That morning, the bank in Dubuque refused a renewal note. By noon, 2 accounts canceled work already drawn. By evening, Thomas was sitting by the stove with his hat still on, holding a telegram from Chicago that said the brokerage had failed. We were not ruined in one thunderclap. Ruin is usually quieter. It enters by canceled orders, unpaid invoices, and men who stand in the doorway with their eyes fixed on the floor. We took in job work for a while. Then none. I sold the small press in 1934 to pay taxes. I sold the second stone in 1937 to a man who wanted it for a garden table and did not deserve it. The last large press went during the war scrap drive, though I lied and said I was proud to see it go. Perhaps I was a little. The country needed iron. Still, I stood at the window after the truck left and felt the floor had forgotten its own weight. There have been more than 30 years of silence since the shop sounded as it should. No roller tack on stone, no sponge in the tray, no paper lifted clean by 2 hands, no argument over whether umber had been mixed too warm. Silence can become a kind of tenant. It pays nothing, but it occupies every room. We lost men as well as work. My husband, Peter Whitcomb, served with the 33rd Division in France and died of influenza at Brest in 1918, after surviving the guns. My brother Matthias was killed near the Meuse that same year. My son Thomas enlisted in the Navy during the next war and was lost in the Atlantic in 1943 when his ship went down escorting a convoy. I have folded 3 flags and unfolded none of them. If you have found the medal, keep it from damp. It was Peter's. The year on the back is the year the Army sent it home with the wrong letter first and the right letter later. Now for the work, because grief without instruction is only fog. If any stones remain, do not scrub them with lye. Use clean water first, then pumice only where the surface is already spoiled. Keep the room between 62 and 68 degrees when drawing if you can manage it, never below 55 unless you want the grease to sulk and the hand to lie. For transfer ink, grind lampblack with burnt umber at 4 parts to 1 if you need a softer black for portraits. Add varnish by drops, not spoonfuls. If the ink strings more than 2 inches from the knife, it is too long for fine lines. Let it rest 12 hours under glass before use. For etching, mix gum arabic to the thickness of thin honey. To 1 ounce of gum, add no more than 6 drops of nitric acid for a living drawing, 8 for a stubborn stone, and 10 only if the surface has already lost its manners. Brush once across, once down, and leave it 3 minutes in winter, 2 in summer, unless the room is above 70 degrees. Then sponge with clean water. Roll lightly. And listen. A stone will tell you whether it is ready by the way it accepts the second pass. Do not hurry drying. Hang prints where air moves but sun does not. 12 hours for proof paper. 24 for heavier rag. Longer if rain is in the walls. Never stack hope on wet paper. I have hidden money. Yes. And prints and tools. Money is the least of it, though it may speak first if hunger is in the room. Use it slowly. Let it keep the roof from rain, the chimney from fire, and the doors from men who believe every unguarded thing belongs to them. Do not spend it to become grand. Grandeur is a poor roof. Repair is better. If you are of my blood, know that blood alone entitles you to nothing without care. If you are not, then perhaps care has brought you nearer than blood would have. An inheritance is not a prize passed to the loudest hand. It is a task set down by the tired for the patient. You may refuse it. That is allowed. But if you accept, begin with sweeping. Begin with water. Begin with the names of those who worked before you and the humility to learn why they did things in the order they did. There is a horseshoe grown into the second walnut behind the shop, set there by my father when I was 12 and certain luck could be nailed to bark. Look for it if the tree still stands. Beneath that tree my mother cooled stones in summer shade, and beneath it Peter asked me to marry him with ink on his cuff and fear in his mouth. The brass key, if it remains where I have placed it, is not for this compartment. You will know its lock only when the tree gives it to you. I am tired now. My hand has begun to wander, and I will not let it spoil what remains. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Adelaide Margarethe Whitcomb, October 3, 1962. Clara read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again, more slowly, letting the sentences come not as information but as weight. The stove cooled. The dog barked once at something outside and stopped. A truck rattled along the warehouse lane and faded. She kept both hands flat on either side of the pages because she did not trust them yet to lift anything. After the second reading, she folded the sheets along their original creases. The first crease resisted, then accepted. The second fell into its former line with a small sigh. Clara matched corner to corner, smoothing nothing too hard, preserving the letter's own memory of how it had slept. When it was folded, she slid it back into the envelope but did not tie the thread. The thread lay beside it, too delicate for repeated use. She placed Peter's medal on top of the envelope. The name on its back no longer stood alone. For several minutes, she cleaned without knowing she had begun. She capped the bottle of rosin. She covered the coins. She moved the lantern farther from the papers. She set the cedar tools in their case with more space between them than before, as if each required room to breathe. Her movements had become exact, but not hurried. Something in the letter had steadied her without offering comfort. Then she went out the back door. The rear yard received the morning plainly. No ceremony waited there. Brown weeds bent under frost. The warehouse wall held yesterday's cold. A cracked gutter leaned against the brick. Beyond the studio, the walnut stand lifted its bare limbs over the lot, each tree similar until she approached them one by one. The first walnut had a split trunk and a hollow near the base where leaves had gathered. The second stood closer to the river slope. Wider than the rest, its bark furrowed in dark ridges. Clara walked around it slowly. On the far side, half swallowed by living wood, was an iron horseshoe. The tree had grown around it for so long that only the curved outer edge showed clearly. Black with age, one nailhead still visible like a blind eye. Bark had folded over the ends. It did not look placed there anymore. It looked remembered by the tree itself. Clara lifted one hand and set her palm near it, not on the iron but on the bark beside it. The cold of the trunk entered her skin. She stood there until her breathing slowed to match the winter yard. Behind her, the studio leaned and waited with its broken roof, its dust, its one guarded stone, its letter now opened by a woman who had arrived with almost nothing but a bill folded warm from her own foot. Before her, the tree held a mark from a father to a daughter, from a child who believed in luck, from a shop that had closed and still refused to surrender the whole of itself. There was no need to speak. The dog nosed through leaves near the fence, found nothing useful, and sneezed. Clara returned inside carrying one fallen walnut husk, dark and dry, though she did not know why she wanted it. She placed it on the counter near the receipt, then began searching the front room shelves with a purpose the letter had given her. If Adelaide had left tools, money, prints, and a letter, she might have left other things in plain sight, not hidden, merely waiting for someone to understand they were not rubbish. In the cabinet beneath the pigeonholes, behind a stack of water-warped invoices, Clara found a shallow drawer stuck shut by swollen wood. She worked it loose with the scraper's handle, easing it in fractions. Inside lay string, a box of rusted paper clips, 2 sealing wax sticks, and a bundle of candles wrapped in newspaper dated 1964. Most were bent. One had cracked clean through, but several remained whole, narrow and cream-colored, their wicks trimmed short. She took one to the stove. The candle had waited nearly 60 years without flame. It had no scent except old wax and paper. Clara set it in a saucer, touched a match to the wick, and watched it refuse at first, then catch in a blue bead that rose into a small yellow tongue. The light it gave was modest, hardly enough to alter the room, yet it changed the surfaces nearest it. The brass scraper warmed in color. The metal's ribbon deepened. The folded letter seemed less like evidence and more like a voice resting after speech. She sat beside the candle until the flame steadied. Only then did the day before, and the weeks before that, begin arranging themselves in her mind. Not as a chain of injuries. Those were there, but they did not ask to be counted. What came forward instead were the small hands that had passed her from one hour to the next without claiming ownership of the rescue. The wreath woman, whose van smelled of cedar and ribbon, had left her with a muffin and 2 clementines and an apology too large for the favor. Mrs. Kettering had placed the softened bill under a paperweight instead of letting it vanish into the cash box, and had given directions as if a person with no address still deserved accuracy. Mr. Lutz had opened a card in a metal file and called his caution business, though both of them knew it was also a door. Doris had folded 3 rolls into the bag and added butter under the cover of not wasting what could be used. Even the dog had shown her the well. None of these kindnesses had declared themselves important. They had been modest and almost deniable. A ride, a number, an account, a heel of butter, a path through weeds. Yet each had set down one plank over dark water, and Clara had crossed because there had been no other way. At this part of the story, maybe you are remembering someone who once did that for you. Not a grand rescue. Not the kind that gets a name carved on a plaque. Maybe a neighbor brought soup and left before you had to thank her. Maybe a clerk explained the form twice. Maybe a stranger gave directions in the rain, or a teacher saw you were tired and did not ask you to perform strength. If you have a kindness like that in your memory, write it down in the comments. Tell us only what you wish to tell. There are people watching tonight who may need to be reminded that a small mercy can travel farther than the person who gave it ever knows. Clara did not know any of that, of course. She only knew the candle was burning, the room was still cold, and the day had work in it. Before sleep could come, she had to put things away. Not hidden as before. Not yet, because she needed to inspect, record, and understand them, but protected from damp, mice, and her own fear. She found a high shelf in the front room that did not sag and cleared it of ledgers too spoiled to save. She laid down dry muslin. The prints she placed flat beneath a board weighted with empty jars. The cedar tools she wrapped again and set toward the back. The coins and paper she returned to the tin, not counted again, not admired. The metal and letter she kept apart. Those she carried with her to the cleared place near the stove. She made her bed as she had the nights before, canvas remnant, spare shirt, coat folded under one shoulder where the floor rose unevenly. But this time she placed the envelope inside Elias's hat, and Peter's medal beside it, and the brass scraper from Adelaide's case along the edge of the satchel, where she could feel it with her fingertips. The objects made no fortress. They did not keep out cold. They did not repair the roof, or test the well, or answer the county's deadlines. Still, the floor seemed less like a place she had fallen, and more like a place from which she might begin. She blew out the candle only when the flame had lowered to a blue point and the wax had pooled clear around the wick. A thread of smoke lifted and vanished into the dark. In the workroom, beneath the great stone, the compartment remained open, its cedar disc set on the bench like a small watchful eye. Clara listened to the studio settle around her. The old sounds were still there, but after the letter they arranged themselves differently. Wood, brick, pipe, stone, and weather, all speaking in the patient grammar of things that had lasted without applause. She tucked her hands beneath her arms. Near the door, the dog shifted in his sleep. Outside, the river moved through the town's low ground. Upstairs nowhere, in rooms that no longer existed, women whose names had been written that morning seemed to continue their work without hurrying. Clara closed her eyes with the folded letter close enough that the paper's edge brushed her cheek when she turned. For the first time in many weeks, she did not sleep as if she might be asked to leave before morning. The first snow came on December 4. 3.5 inches by the measure Clara took from the top of the alley gate with a ruler borrowed from McAvoy Hardware. It fell without wind, straight down through the walnut branches and across the broken roof, covering the condemned sign, the rusted gutter, the stacked pallets, and the dog's narrow path beneath the porch. By morning the studio looked gentler than it was. Snow has always had that habit. It rounds sharp failures, hides rot under clean light, and makes every roof appear whole until the melt begins. Clara knew better. At noon, the rear workroom began dripping in 7 places. She set jars beneath 5, the galvanized basin beneath 1, and an enamel pitcher beneath the worst seam, where water struck metal with a slow, accusatory note. The great stone was covered in muslin and canvas now, the packages recorded and stored away from damp, the letter wrapped in waxed paper inside the front counter drawer. She checked them twice before she checked her own shoes. That evening she read the roofing chapter in Mr. Lutz's repair manual 3 times at the counter, the lantern close to her left hand and the pencil in her right. The first reading gave her words: decking, underlayment, flashing, drip edge, starter course, exposure, ridge cap. The second gave her sequence. The third gave her fear in a useful form. She measured the roof the next morning before the snow softened. The studio was 22 feet across and 39 feet along the eave, with a simple shed slope dropping toward the riverside. The rear seam had failed where a later lean-to had been removed and badly patched, leaving a strip of exposed decking 12 feet long and 2 feet wide. The roof surface, counting waste, needed 9 squares of 3-tab asphalt shingles if she covered only the main slope and patched the front edge, though Mr. Lutz warned her to buy 10 because a person learning on a roof should plan for crooked cuts. She wrote it down. 10 squares. 15-pound felt, 2 rolls. Roofing nails, galvanized, 1 1/4 inch, 25 pounds. Drip edge, 32 linear feet. Step flashing, if the chimney base proved worse than it looked. Tar paper caps. Roof cement. Chalk line. Utility blades. The numbers filled a page. The cost filled another. She did not reach for the hidden money at once. Adelaide's instruction had settled into Clara with the seriousness of a rule, used slowly. So she took only what was needed for materials, recording each dollar in a school notebook from the pharmacy clearance bin. She wrote the purpose, date, amount, and reason. Roof before comfort. Dry before beautiful. She kept the notebook in the tin box whenever she was not writing in it. When Mr. Lutz saw her list, he adjusted 3 quantities without asking permission. You forgot waste. I wrote 1 extra square. You forgot weather. He added another roll of felt. Behind him, the store windows held a gray noon. He moved down the aisles with his uneven step and built the order piece by piece. At the end, while Clara was tying her list into the account folder, he disappeared into the back room and returned with a roofing hatchet. It had a leather-wrapped handle darkened by use, a square pole, and a notched blade for pulling nails. One side bore initials scratched shallowly into the metal. "My uncle's," he said. "He roofed barns from here to Elizabeth. I cannot buy that. I did not say buy." She kept both hands at her sides. He set it on the counter between them. "Use it. Bring it back when the roof stops leaking." "What if I damn?" "Then you will learn why he cursed apprentices." The next person to enter the work was not Clara's idea. He came on the morning the materials were delivered by flatbed, riding in the passenger seat beside the driver as if he were part of the lumber order. He was a narrow man in a brown barn coat, with a wool cap pulled low and a face carved into long weathered planes. His name was Silas Rook. He had roofed until his knees refused ladders, then had repaired church gutters, porch flashing, and henhouse leaks for widows who paid him in eggs he did not need. Mr. Lutz had sent him without sending him, which is to say he had mentioned the address while loading felt rolls and allowed the man to decide. Silas stood in the snow, looking up at the roofline. "Bad patch," he said. "Yes, sir." "Worse under it." "I expect so." He looked at her then. "Good." He would not take pay. He would not take coffee, because she had none worth offering. He accepted 1 roll from Doris's paper bag after Clara placed it on the porch railing and walked away from it. That was how they began. They worked 11 days, not every hour of every day, because weather and daylight governed them. Silas did not climb high at first. He stood on the ladder, handed up tools, corrected her from below, and made her come down whenever her footwork became careless. On the 3rd day, when she had learned where the roof was soft and where it held, he climbed beside her for the sister rafter. The failed strip near the rear had rotted 2 rafters along the upper edge. Silas showed her how to cut back to sound wood, how to fit a sister rafter tight against the weakened one, how to clamp before fastening, and how to drive 16-penny nails at alternating angles so new strength married the remaining frame rather than merely sitting beside it. Do not tap timber. She struck once. Again. She struck harder. Now his teaching came in small sentences. Some were no longer than the movements they corrected. That nail's proud. Line wander. Snap it again. Blade away. All. He showed her the chalk line on the 5th day, after the felt lay smooth and black beneath their knees. The line had to be held taut enough to sing. Lifted clean. Released straight. When she snapped it badly, blue chalk jumped in a wavering mark across the felt. Silas shook his head, climbed down, and made her sweep it off with a rag. Roof remembers mistakes. So do hands, Clara said. He looked at her for half a second, then handed the line back. By the 7th day, she had learned the 3-stroke nail. Set. Drive. Seat. Not 4 uncertain pecks. Not one proud blow that tore the shingle. 3 strokes, each with a purpose. The hatchet's weight changed in her grip as her wrist understood it. The first stroke placed the nail through shingle and felt. The second sent it almost flush. The third finished it without bruising the surface. When she missed, Silas did not comfort her. He pointed. Snow melted from the lower edge and froze again by noon. Her knees bruised. Her palms blistered beneath the gloves. Tar found her sleeve and remained there like a black accusation. Each evening she came down more slowly, checked the stove, ate whatever Doris or her own oatmeal allowed, and marked the day's progress in the notebook. She slept under a roof still open in places, but with fewer jars catching water. On December 15, under a sky the color of pewter, they set the last ridge cap over the repaired seam and sealed the chimney flashing with roof cement warmed in a pan near the stove. Silas inspected the line from the ground, hands in his coat pockets, boots planted in thin snow. It will shed, he said. For him, that was praise enough. Clara climbed down last, carrying the borrowed hatchet with its leather handle damp from her glove. She stood in the yard and listened. No drip struck the basin inside. No water ticked into jars. The roof did not look new, and that was a mercy. It looked mended. Deliberate. Sober. A thing asked to keep weather out rather than impress anyone passing below. Silas took the last roll Doris had sent, broke it in half, and gave the larger piece back to Clara. Eat, he said. She did. By January, the roof held, and the chimney began confessing. The trouble showed first as powder on the hearth. Each morning, after the stove cooled, Clara found a small drift of pale mortar beneath the chimney throat, as if the brickwork had been grinding its teeth in the night. When she climbed the ladder outside and looked from the rear slope, keeping both knees low and one hand on the roofline as Silas had taught, she saw spalling along the upper courses. Bricks had shed their faces in thin red scales. Mortar joints near the cap had opened wide enough to take the point of her knife. A chimney can draw well enough to deceive a person while still failing by inches. Mr. Let's send her home with a second booklet. This one older, its cover nearly loose. Masonry repairs for farm and small dwelling chimneys. He also sold her the materials in modest quantities: hydraulic lime, 1 bag, washed sand, 2 sacks, fire clay, 5 pounds, a mason's trowel from a crate of used tools, joint raker, pointing trowel, soft brush, burlap for curing. He refused to sell Portland cement for the joints nearest the old brick. Too hard, he said. It says the wrong mortar if you want the brick to live. For the outer repointing, Silas and Mr. Lutz agreed on 1 part hydraulic lime to 2½ parts sand. Mixed stiff enough to hold on the trowel, but not so dry it crumbled. For the firebox throat and hot face repairs, Mr. Lutz had her blend fireclay with sand and lime in a smaller batch, 2 parts fireclay, 1 part lime, 3 parts sand, wetted slowly and rested 15 minutes before use. He made her repeat the ratios before he wrote them on the account card. Say them. 1 lime, 2½ sand for outside. 2 fireclay. 1 lime, 3 sand where heat touches. Do not make soup. No, sir. January stayed in the 20s most days, sometimes rising to 28 in the week afternoon and falling hard after sunset. Mortar did not love that weather. Neither did fingers. Clara learned to mix small batches in a basin near the stove, carry them out wrapped in cloth, and work only while the material remained willing. Every 15 minutes her bare hands began to go numb. Gloves were clumsy for pointing, so she wore them only between joints, pulling them off with her teeth when she needed the trowel's edge exact. First she raked out the failed mortar. The tool made a gritty rasp along the joints, and powdered lime fell down the roof slope in pale streaks. She worked no deeper than needed, stopping when the remaining mortar held firm. Bad brick faces she brushed clean but did not remove unless they had fully loosened. On the worst course, 3 bricks near the cap had to be lifted and reset. Silas came for that part, standing on the ladder below while Clara passed each brick down in both hands. Keep the face. I marked it. Mark better. She did. The work was slow because chimneys punish haste. Each joint had to be dampened first, not soaked, so the thirsty brick would not steal water from the mortar too quickly. Then she packed the mix into the gap in layers, pressing hard with the narrow trowel, cutting off excess, striking the joint when it had firmed enough to take a clean line. She covered fresh work with damp burlap and checked it like bread rising. The cold entered through everything. It entered through the roof beneath her knees. It entered through her cuffs when she reached high. It entered the cracked skin beside her thumbnails and opened it again after each washing. Some afternoons she climbed down after only 2 hours because the mortar would not behave, and her hands had lost precision. Those days she did indoor work, brushing soot from the clean-out, patching the stove board, oiling hinges, copying Adelaide's craft instructions onto a cleaner sheet. The chimney took 3 weeks because every sound joint depended on the one before it. There was no single day when it became sound, only a slow reduction of doubt. In the last week of January, with the top courses repointed and the cap reset under a wash of lime-rich mortar, Clara lit the test fire. She chose dry walnut twigs, a small split of oak Silas had left by the door, and 1 twist of paper. The stove door remained cracked. The thermometer lay ready. She stood with her coat on and her eyes moving between pipe joint, thimble, hearth, wall, and the place where the chimney passed through the roof. Smoke rose. It did not hesitate this time. The draft took it cleanly, pulling the first gray thread upward with a steadiness that changed the room before heat did. Outside, Clara walked through snow to the rear of the studio and looked up. Smoke lifted from the chimney in a narrow blue line, straight at first, then carried east by wind over the warehouse roof. No seepage from the brick. No smell through the wall. No coughing back into the front room. Mr. Lutz came by near dusk under the pretense of delivering more nails. He stood in the yard and looked at the chimney. Draw. Yes, sir. Then he placed 2 pieces of seasoned maple beside the door and left before she could thank him properly. That night the stove held a steady fire for 3 hours. Clara kept it modest, feeding it 1 piece at a time, watching the thermometer remain in the safe middle range. The front room warmed enough for frost to leave the inside of the boards. The counter lost its chill. The dog came inside for the first time. Not far, only over the threshold, circling twice before lying near the door with his nose pointed toward escape. Clara sat on the floor with her hands open toward the stove, feeling the ache leave her knuckles by degrees. The room did not become easy. It became possible. The floors waited until the chimney could be trusted, because dust and cold together make poor companions. The front room's white pine planks had gone gray under grime, but where Clara scraped near the counter leg, she found a warmer color beneath. Dark honey at first, then something deeper where ink and time had entered the grain. The nails were hand-cut roseheads in the earliest boards, their square shoulders set slightly uneven, not like factory nails, but like decisions made one by one. Later patches had wire nails and poorer pine. She left the patches where they held, marking only the boards that had to be lifted near the door and beside the stove. Mr. Lutz rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day and required a deposit he wrote down but did not collect. 2 days, he said. I may need 3. You will need 2 if you do not admire your own progress. He sent paper discs in 3 grits, 80, 120, 220. He sent a dust mask better than the first and made her buy earplugs for 30 cents. Silas, passing the hardware door as she left, looked at the sander and said only, "Keep it moving." She began with the damaged boards. The third plank inside the front door had split around 2 nails and dipped because the support below had loosened. Clara lifted it carefully after numbering its underside, then sistered a short cleat along the joist edge, using screws where no one would see them and resetting the plank with salvaged nails where the heads mattered. Beside the stove, one board had charred along the edge from some long ago coal spill. She trimmed the worst splintering, left the dark mark, and wrote in the notebook, scar sound, keep. Then came sanding. The 80 grit pass was not gentle. It removed the gray crust, the hardened drips, the high splinters that caught cloth, and the grime worked into the upper fibers by decades of boots. Clara moved with the grain whenever possible, guiding the sander slowly enough to cut, but not so slowly it hollowed. The machine pulled against her hands like a stubborn animal. Dust rose despite the bag, entered her sleeves, settled in her hair, turned the air pale. After every 4 feet, she stopped, vacuumed with Mr. Lutz's borrowed shop vac, and checked the nail heads. Any proud metal would tear paper or spark. She set them with a punch, one by one. The first pass took all day. At dusk, the floor looked wounded, raw in some places, streaked in others. She was too tired to know whether she had improved it. So she swept, covered the work with clean cloth where the roof light still leaked dust, and slept in the back room beside the covered stone. The 120 grit pass revealed the room. The pine began to join itself. Boards that had looked unrelated under dirt now showed long lines of amber, rose, brown, and smoke-dark grain. Around the counter, where customers or printers had stood for years, the wood held a subtle hollow that she did not sand away. Near the old press marks in the workroom, the floor had darkened almost to mahogany. She knelt there and ran one hand above the surface without touching, the way Elias had once taught her to feel respect before contact. The 220 grit pass was for the hand. By then she was no longer removing the past. She was preparing it to be touched. The sander whispered instead of growled. The dust became finer, almost flour-soft, and settled along the baseboards in pale drifts. Clara moved slowly, shoulders aching, mind reduced to pressure, direction, and sound. When the rented machine finally stopped and the room fell silent, her ears rang for several minutes. She returned the sander on the second evening. Mr. Lutz looked surprised and tried not to show it. Admired less than expected, he said. A little less. For finishing, she chose tung oil cut for the first coat, then boiled linseed oil for the second and third where wear would be lighter, following advice gathered from the booklet, Mr. Lutz and a retired cabinet maker Doris sent from the cafe to look at the floor without admitting she had sent him. The first coat went on thin, worked in with cloth, not poured. Clara watched the pine darken under her hand. The color shifted from dry straw to dark honey. Then, in the workroom, toward a reddish mahogany where ink had lived in the grain longer than she had been alive. 48 hours of cure between coats. That was the rule. Waiting was harder than labor because it gave the mind room to make noise. Clara blocked the door, kept the dog out with an apology he did not accept, and stepped only on boards laid across safe paths. The room smelled rich and sharp, oil and pine and winter air. The finish did not shine like a new floor in a magazine. It glowed low, as if light had been rubbed into it and asked to stay humble. The bad morning came after the second coat. She woke before dawn with her body refusing its own instructions. Her hands would not close around the broom. Her knees hurt from roofing, chimney work, sanding, and cold floors. The roof was better, the chimney safer, the boards warmer, yet the list ahead seemed to lengthen each time she crossed out a task. Windows, plaster, foundation. Well, taxes, inspection, tools, materials, food, debt, always the account card waiting in McAvoy Hardware's metal box. She made no fire. Instead, she walked past the walnut stand, past the warehouse, and down toward the marshy place where the river widened around reeds and low brush. Snow lay in dirty folds along the bank. The morning had no color yet. She sat on a flat stone with her coat wrapped around her and watched water move beneath a thin skin of ice. A great blue heron stood in the shallows. It was too early for it. She would have thought, if thinking had been useful. The bird held itself in the cold with a patience that seemed older than weather. Long legs, folded neck, spear beak pointed toward the water. It did nothing for so long that Clara stopped waiting for it to do anything. Then, without hurry, it stepped once. The water accepted the foot. Minutes passed. It stepped again. She stayed there until the light came fully, and the heron lifted away on broad wings, slow at first, then certain above the reeds. She did no work that day. She returned to the studio, ate oats, warmed her hands, and sat on the counter side of the room where the oil was curing. Not every day had to prove her worthy of the one before it. A floor could cure without being watched. A roof could shed without praise. A chimney could stand while a woman rested. The studio had been waiting, and so had she. On the following morning, she laid the third coat. This time her hand did not tremble. February entered through glass that was not there. The studio had 8 windows if one counted the rear sash over the dry sink, which Clara did because wind certainly counted it. 3 had no glass at all, only boards nailed across the frames from the outside. 4 were cracked in long patient lines, some taped decades earlier, the tape now brown and curled. 1 window, narrow and high on the north wall, still held its original pane. Wavy and imperfect, with tiny bubbles suspended in the glass like trapped breath. A date had been scratched into the lower sash, 1888. Clara did not replace that one. She cleaned it with vinegar, water, and newspaper, slowly, working around the brittle putty with cotton wrapped over a stick. When light entered through it afterward, the room beyond the pane bent slightly, softened by old glass that had never promised perfect truth. She marked it in the notebook. Preserve. No scraping. The other 7 required work. Mr. Lutz sold her DAP 33 glazing putty and said the brand name as if it were a dependable neighbor. He added glazing points, a stiff putty knife, a softer one, a glass cutter he let her borrow, and a coil of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord. For the missing panes, he measured twice from Clara's notes, then cut glass in the back of the store on a felt-covered bench while she watched. Score once. Do not saw. Break over the edge. Respect the line. You ever... No, sir. You will hate the first one. I expected to. You will hate the second less. He was partly right. The first sash fought every inch. Clara removed it from the frame after labeling top, bottom, inside, and room. The old putty had hardened nearly to stone in places and remained soft as spoiled cheese in others. She used the chisel gently, then heat from a borrowed lamp where the wood could take it, then the stiff knife, easing out shards of glass and collecting them in a coffee can marked sharp. She found mouse nests in 2 weight pockets and a dead wasp folded between sash and stop. The sash cord had rotted on most windows, leaving the weights fallen inside their pockets. Clara opened the side trim carefully and retrieved the iron counterweights one by one, each tied to nothing, each heavy with silence. Mr. Lutz had shown her the knot on a length of cord in the store. Figure 8 at the counterweight. Feed over pulley. Tie to sash. Test travel before closing the pocket. Do not let the rope cross itself. Do not curse the pulley until you know it deserves it. She cursed one pulley softly. It deserved it. The DAP 33 putty had to be kneaded before use, worked until it warmed in the hand and lost its stiffness. Clara rolled it into thin ropes and pressed it into the rabbet, bedded the glass gently, set the glazing points with the putty knife, then laid the final bevel with a steady draw from corner to corner. Her first bevel looked like a creek after spring flood. She scraped it out and tried again. By the 3rd window, her wrist learned the angle. By the 5th, she understood that putty rewards neither force nor hesitation. The knife had to move with enough pressure to seal and enough mercy to glide. Too dry, and the line tore. Too soft, and it sagged. Corners required patience beyond what seemed reasonable. She rebuilt several. She learned to keep whiting powder nearby for her fingers, to clean the knife after each pass, to set the sash flat and work at a height that did not ruin the shoulder. Cold complicated everything. Putty stiffened near the door. Glass fogged when she breathed too close. The repaired sashes had to cure where dust would not settle into them, so she made a rack from scrapboards and placed it near, but not too near, the stove. The dog attempted to inspect the second sash and left one faint nose mark on the glass. Clara left it until the putty skinned over, then cleaned it away with a rag and told him he had made his contribution. The cracked panes she did not always discard. One crack in the front room ran from upper corner to lower middle, clean and stable. Replacing it would have meant losing glass that had looked onto the street for generations. So she stabilized the sash, reglazed the edges, and left the line. Another pane, broken into 3 loose pieces, had to go. She wrapped those shards in newspaper and wrote broken window. East wall, February on the bundle before placing it with other refuse. Even discarding deserved a record. The last window was the rear sash above the sink. It had no glass, no cord, and one side rail soft from the roof leak. Clara sistered the rail with a narrow strip of salvaged pine, clamped it overnight, and sanded the repair by hand. The counterweight pockets were full of walnut shells carried in by some ambitious creature. She cleaned them out with a spoon. When the new cord finally ran over the pulley and the sash rose without grinding, she stood back as if listening for approval. Outside that window, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch. It was a small bird, round against the cold, with black cap, white cheek, and feet so slight they seemed unable to belong to winter. It tipped its head toward the glass, saw either Clara or its own brief reflection, and remained there while she pressed the last line of putty into place. The knife moved from lower left to upper right in one clean draw. No tear, no sag, no ragged corner. The bird flicked its wings once and flew. Clara set the putty knife down. By late afternoon, all 8 windows held what they were meant to hold, glass where glass was needed, air kept mostly outside, light admitted with its distortions and histories intact. The studio was not warm, not fully, but the drafts had lost their teeth. The front room brightened differently now. The workroom no longer felt like a closed box. Through the preserved north pane, the winter sky entered in a wavering sheet of silver, and across the floor, the repaired boards took the light without asking to be new. Clara washed her hands in cold water, dried them on a flour sack, and wrote the day's final line in the notebook. 8 windows set. 1 kept. Then she closed the cover and placed the pencil beside it, careful not to disturb the putty curing in its quiet frames. The plaster announced its failures after the windows began holding. For weeks, the walls had seemed merely stained, cracked, and tired, which was different from unsound. Once the drafts lessened and the stove could keep a low heat through the evening, the room began to dry by degrees, and drying made weakness visible. Near the chimney, 3 patches loosened in the front room with a faint sandy whisper Clara first mistook for ash settling. By morning, flakes lay on the floor beneath the wall, and when she touched the area with 2 fingers, the plaster bowed inward from the hand-split oak lath behind it. She stood there a while, palm against the wall, feeling the hollow. The original plaster was horsehair, lime, sand, and time. When a small piece broke free, she carried it to the counter and examined it under the lantern. Fine hairs lay through the matrix like old roots. The backside bore the ridged impression of lath, each narrow strip split by hand, not sawed, its surface irregular enough to give plaster a tooth. The wall had been built by people who expected their work to outlive their impatience. Mr. Lutz still had, improbably, half a burlap bag of horsehair in the store loft, purchased in the 1950s by his father and forgotten behind stovepipe fittings. He brought it down himself, sneezing twice, and set it on the counter. You do not need. It is still good. Dry hair keeps better than some men. For the scratch coat, Clara mixed lime putty with clean sand and chopped horsehair, working the hair through slowly so it did not clump. She dampened the exposed lath with a brush, then pressed the plaster hard through the gaps until it mushroomed behind the strips, forming the keys that would hold after curing. Before it set, she scored the surface in shallow lines with a scrap of lath, roughing it for the next coat. The brown coat came 3 days later, 3/8 of an inch thick, leveled with a straight board and left under damp cloth for 72 hours. It was heavier work than she expected, not in distance or danger, but in patience of the shoulder. Press. Draw. Correct. Do not polish too soon. Do not overwork the lime until it turns slick and weak. The finish coat was only 1/8 inch. That thinness required more care than the thicker layers. She used the small trowel lightly, feathering the edges into the surviving wall, keeping the patch honest rather than invisible. Perfect concealment would have felt like a lie. These were repairs, not erasures. When the last coat took the light, pale and damp against the aged wall, Clara cleaned the trowel, wiped the floor beneath, and stood back. "These patches will hold another 100 years." She said it softly, not as a boast, more as an agreement with the hands that had made the wall before hers arrived. Doris never asked whether Clara had eaten. She disliked questions that made a person choose between pride and truth, so she arrived at answers by other roads. On Tuesdays and Fridays, after the cafe closed between lunch and supper, she came down Water Street carrying 2 brown paper bags, one in each hand, her red scarf tied over her hair and her coat buttoned crooked because she was always leaving somewhere in the middle of one more task. She placed the bags on the studio porch, knocked once with her knuckles, and stepped back before Clara opened the door. "Day-olds," she said the first time. Inside were rolls, a cracked heel of cheddar, 2 apples with bruises cut out, a jar of soup, and coffee grounds in a folded filter. "I cannot keep taking this." "You are not taking. I am relocating." "Doris." The woman lifted one hand. "Payment later." "With what?" Doris looked past Clara into the room where the windows had begun admitting a clear winter light, then toward the workroom where the covered stone sat under canvas. In candles when the shop reopened. There was no smile after it. She said the sentence as if ordering flour. Because she said it plainly, Clara could receive it. After that, the bags became part of the week. Sometimes they held biscuits, sometimes potato soup in a mason jar. Once, an entire pie with a cracked crust and a note pinned to the top collapsed on left side. Still moral. Clara washed every jar and returned it. Doris pretended not to notice the jars came back cleaner than when they left. Caleb arrived with a splitting maul over one shoulder, and a Schwinn bicycle dropped in the snow outside the gate. He was 16 or near it. All elbows, wrists, and serious eyes under a cap too large for him. The bicycle was blue with rust on the fenders and a milk crate tied over the back wheel. He stood on the porch as if he had been sent to deliver a court summons. "Mrs. Pike said you need wood split." Clara did not know a Mrs. "Pike." "My mother," he added. "I can pay a little. I do not take labor from children. I'm not a child." His voice cracked on the last word and made both of them look aside. He recovered by lifting the maul. "My mother said," he began, and then stopped, as if the rest had to be repeated exactly. "About your grandfather." That was all. Clara stepped back and let him enter the yard. Caleb split badly at first. He aimed with force instead of line, burying the maul in rounds that did not open, then wrenching it free until his ears reddened. Clara had split little wood herself, but Silas passed by near noon, watched 3 strokes, and could not endure a 4th. "Read the check," he told the boy. Caleb frowned. Silas pointed to the end grain. Tree already wrote where to split. By afternoon, the boy had learned enough to make the work sound different. The maul rose, paused, fell. Oak opened with a clean wooden crack. He stacked each piece bark up along the warehouse wall, leaving air between rows because Silas barked the word airflow at him once, and no one wished to hear it twice. When Clara tried again to pay him, he shook his head. "My mother said not to come home with money." "Then take roll." He accepted 3 rolls wrapped in cloth, mounted the Schwinn in the failing light, and rode uphill with the maul balanced across his handlebars like a banner from some modest country. Reverend Boyd did not enter the story as a man seeking to be useful. He was simply there each morning, walking past the lower road in a dark overcoat and a black hat gone green at the brim. His church stood uphill. Methodist, brick, with a bell that rang 10 minutes late according to Doris and exactly right according to him. He walked the same route before breakfast, past the coal office, past the warehouse, past the walnut trees, never lingering, never peering in, never asking whether Clara had found salvation in the ruined building or wished to discuss it near a draft. At first, he only tipped his hat. Clara nodded back from the porch, broom in hand or ash bucket at her feet. On the 5th morning, he paused at the gate and looked toward the roof. Then the chimney, then the windows. He did not praise. Praise can become a debt in certain mouths. He only lifted his hand slightly. Mercy keep you steady. 4 words. Then he walked on. After that, he said the same thing every morning, no louder than the sound of his shoes on gravel. When snow fell, he said it. When Thaw made mud at the gate, he said it. When Caleb was splitting wood and pretended not to listen, he said it. The words did not fix a thing. They did not buy mortar, set glass, or feed a stove. But they passed the studio each day like a thread drawn through cloth, and over time even a thread can remind torn places how to hold. Clara postponed the cellar until February 11. That was the first date she could write in the notebook without making excuses beside it. The roof no longer leaked into the workroom. The chimney drew. The floor had cured. The windows held. Plaster near the stove was damp but sound under burlap. She had avoided the cellar not because she forgot it, but because every house has one place where imagination grows faster than facts, and below-ground rooms are especially good at that. The cellar door lay under a slanted hatch behind the workroom, half hidden by stacked boards and an iron frame from some lost piece of equipment. She cleared the area in the morning, carrying each board outside and marking which could be saved. The hatch strap was rusted but intact. It lifted with a groan that brought the dog to the threshold and made him decide immediately against participation. 7 granite steps descended into cold. They had been worn hollow in the center by feet carrying coal, jars, water, tools, perhaps children sent down unwillingly for potatoes. Clara held the lantern low and tested each step before trusting it. The walls below were fieldstone, tight-fitted in places, patched with mortar in others, and beaded with moisture where earth pressed close. The floor measured 12 by 15 feet, more or less, laid in fieldstone except at the center, where a single dressed granite slab had been set with deliberate care. It did not belong to the floor by accident. The slab was rectangular, smooth compared to the stones around it, and marked near one corner with a carved symbol, an ampersand inside a square. The same craft mark from the prints. Clara crouched beside it, lantern flame bending in the draft from the open hatch. There was no ring, no obvious seam, no instruction. The stone looked heavy, settled, and certain of itself. She did not lift it. Some discoveries must be left with their hour intact. The letter had said the brass key would find its lock when the tree gave it. This slab did not ask for her hand yet. She recorded its measurements, traced the mark onto paper, and brushed dust from the edges. Then she stood and turned to the shelves along the wall. Most held ordinary remains. 2 cracked crocks, a box of bottle caps, coal dust, a broken shovel, 3 jars with rusted lids and nothing in them worth risking glass. Near the back wall, beneath a beam, She found a pile of dry walnut shells and scraps of paper carried down by mice. She cleared them with a broom. It was on the stairs going up that the box appeared. Not in the cellar proper, not hidden behind the mysterious slab, but wedged beneath the third step from the bottom where a narrow board had loosened at one end. Clara noticed it because the toe of her boot struck wood where stone should have been. She knelt on the fourth step and worked the board free. The box was oak, no longer than her forearm, dark with age and fitted with tiny brass hinges. Its lid had swollen shut. She carried it upstairs before opening it, unwilling to break it in the cellar damp. At the counter, with the afternoon light through the mended windows, she eased the seam with the bodkin until the lid lifted. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype photograph. The key was unlike the county keys, unlike any house key she had held. Its shaft was narrow, its bit cut with 2 deep steps, and its bow had been shaped into the same ampersand within a square, simplified so it could be held between finger and thumb. It had been polished once, then left to darken in the box. Clara set it on the mantel above the stove, where it caught a low thread of light. The tintype was wrapped in tissue. She unfolded it slowly and found a young woman standing in front of the studio in summer. The sign above the door was sharp. The windows were open. A vine grew along the porch. The woman wore a pale shirtwaist and a dark skirt, sleeves rolled, one hand resting on a lithographic roller almost as tall as her forearm. Her face stopped Clara before the rest could enter. It was not identical. No photograph of the dead repeats the living perfectly. But the line of the mouth, the set of the eyes, the high cheekbones softened by youth, the guarded steadiness of the chin were near enough that Clara set the image down and stepped back from it. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, Johannes Adelaide, daughter of Thomas Whitcomb, age 25, summer of 1903. Clara read it twice. Then she placed the tintype beside the letter, not in it, not under it, but beside it, as if 2 voices had been seated at the same table. The brass key remained on the mantel. She did not know what it opened. By evening, when the cellar hatch was closed and the third step repaired enough not to trap a foot, Clara stood in the front room watching the key. Firelight moved over its shaped bow, making the ampersand appear and vanish. The granite slab below waited in darkness. The walnut tree outside held its horseshoe without explanation. For once, Clara did not press toward an answer. The house had begun giving things in its own order. She could learn that order, or she could ruin it by hunger. She chose to learn. By March, snow retreated from the edges first. It pulled back from the brick foundation, from the warehouse wall, from the bases of the walnut trees, leaving behind flattened grass, black leaves, and the first smell of thawed earth. The creek beyond the lower lot grew loud with snowmelt, and the river took on a brown muscle that moved branches, foam, and secrets downstream without consultation. In the mornings, Clara could hear water before she opened the door. The walnut catkins came late, small and greenish, hanging from branches that had looked dead only weeks before. Chickadees became frequent. So did mud. The dog tracked it through the front room once, examined the prints his paws left on the newly oiled floor, and retreated to the porch before Clara found words. She cleaned the marks with a damp cloth and added a mat to her account from McAvoy Hardware. The studio changed less than spring did. Its repairs were modest to the eye. The roof shed rain. The chimney drew. The windows held light. The plaster patches dried pale and firm. The cellar remained closed except for weekly checks. The stone in the workroom stayed covered, not from neglect now, but from respect. Clara read Adelaide's technical instructions each evening, copying temperatures, ratios, rest times, and warnings onto clean cards. She sorted the sample stones. She cleaned the glass palettes. She practiced grinding ink without printing, feeling the knife and slab, learning again the sound of mixture becoming usable. But she did not begin the craft that spring. The decision came slowly, then settled completely. Desire alone was not readiness. The roof had taught her that. So had the chimney. She would not uncover the large stone and ask it to receive an unsteady hand merely because inheritance had called her name. She would order proper materials in small amounts, using one duplicate coin only if there was no other way, and practice on the hand-size samples first. She would learn the room's humidity, the stove's moods, the way paper behaved near the river, the difference between a warm April day and a damp one. She wrote to a supplier in Chicago for lithographic crayons, gum arabic, prepared paper, and a modest tin of black ink. She enclosed no story. Only an order, carefully written. When the parcel arrived 2 weeks later, tied in brown paper and smelling faintly of wax and warehouse dust, she set it unopened on the counter until after supper. Then she opened it cleanly with a knife. Each item went into the cabinet, labeled by date. Not used. Not yet. In April, Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard without asking Clara first. Clara discovered it only because Caleb mentioned it while returning a sharpened axe. Old print shop restoration. Handmade candles. Small popper. Reopening quietly. Inquire at River Bend Cafe. Doris had written it in blue ink. Plain letters. No flourish. Clara stood before the corkboard with a sack of rolls in her arms and read the card 3 times. There was no promise of prints. No grand opening. No claim to mastery. Only a small line cast into town, light enough to retrieve if it caught nothing. The first inquiry came from a woman wanting candles for a church supper. The second, from Mrs. Kettering, who wanted 6 note cards when there were note cards to want. The third, from a man who asked whether the shop bought antique presses, and Clara wrote his number carefully, though she could not yet bear to call. Spring did not hurry her. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Clara pulled the first completed print from the small press she had bought, used from a retired art teacher in Platteville. It was not made on the great stone. That one still waited under its cover, cleaned only at the edges, studied but not claimed. The first proper print came from a small limestone sample, one of the practice stones found in the cabinet, grained by hand on a sheet of glass with carborundum grit until its surface accepted water evenly. The image was modest, the north window with its wavy 1888 pane, a walnut branch outside, and a chickadee perched where one had once watched her draw putty into a clean line. She had worked on it for 6 weeks. Not every day. Some days were for orders, repairs, weather, bookwork, or fatigue. Some were for making mistakes on scraps no one would see. But on the morning of December 12, with the room at 64 degrees and the stove holding steady, she dampened the stone, rolled the ink lightly, laid the paper, and turned the press bed with both hands. The old machine gave a low mechanical complaint, then moved. When she lifted the paper, the image held. Not perfectly. A faint weakness showed near the lower left where she had underrolled. One line in the branch was heavier than intended. The chickadee's eye had nearly filled. Elias would have seen all of it. Adelaide would have seen more. Clara saw it too. And because she saw it, she smiled only with her hands. placing the proof on the drying line between two wooden clips. She wrote beneath it in pencil, "First acceptable proof." The restored interior did not look restored in the way magazines prefer. No wall had been stripped to fashionable bareness. No surface had been made to look untouched by use. The front counter remained scarred, cleaned and oiled but not replaced. The pigeonholes held invoices, paper packets, candle labels, and Mrs. Kettering's order for note cards written in her precise hand. The floor glowed low where winter light crossed it. Honey in the front room. Darker in the workroom where the press had returned weight to the boards. The plaster patches near the chimney had cured to a pale tone slightly different from the surrounding wall, honest as mended cloth. The 8 windows admitted weather, river light, and passing birds. The stove stood where it had stood, blacked and sound. Above it, on the mantel, lay the brass key with the ampersand bow. For nearly 2 years it had remained there, dusted weekly, unanswered. Clara had tried it in no random locks. That would have felt discourteous. She had waited for the tree to give its meaning. As the letter had said, though waiting does not always feel noble while one is doing it, sometimes it feels like a key gathering dust. The answer came after an ice storm. A line of freezing rain passed through Galena on February 7, 2025. Coating branches, wires, porch rails, and the studio sign in clear weight. By morning, the second walnut behind the shop had lost a limb as wide as Clara's waist. It had torn away from the trunk near the old horseshoe, leaving a raw wound of pale wood and a scatter of frozen twigs across the yard. Clara stood before it with a saw in her hand, grieving the damage as one grieves harm to a living witness. The broken limb had opened a cavity. Not large, not obvious from a distance. But when she cleared splintered wood near the horseshoe, she saw beneath the fold of bark a small brass plate set into the trunk, green with age, almost swallowed by growth. At its center was a keyhole. Clara went inside for the key. She did not run. Running would have been wrong for that kind of moment. She took it from the mantel, wiped the bow with a cloth, and returned to the tree while the morning sun turned every iced branch into a quiet lamp. The key entered stiffly. She turned it with both hands cupped around the bow. The plate released. Behind it, inside a cavity lined long ago with tin and cedar, lay a packet wrapped in oilcloth. Clara carried it to the workbench before opening it, because some things found outdoors still belonged to a table. Inside was a folded 48-star flag, small enough to have been folded many times. Its white stripes yellowed but clean, its blue field faded to the color of evening. With it was a note, written in Adelaide's hand but older than the letter, dated November 11, 1945, to the one who finds the keys patience. This flag was sent to me after my son Thomas was declared lost at sea in 1943. I could not bear to keep it in a drawer where grief would turn sour, nor could I give it away while I still had breath to remember him. I have placed it in the walnut, near my father's horseshoe, because trees understand holding without speaking. If you find it, let it see daylight. If you can, say his name or water can hear it. Thomas Whitcomb, Seaman First Class, United States Navy. Adelaide M. Whitcomb. Armistice Day, 1945. Clara laid the note beside the flag and stood with her hands resting on the bench. Outside, the ice began to melt. Drops fell from the walnut branches, striking snow with tiny dark marks. The studio had offered another chamber of its heart, not from the cellar slab, not from the obvious mystery, but from a living tree wounded by weather and still faithful to its keeping. That spring, on May 26, 2025. Memorial Day. Clara carried Peter's medal and Thomas's folded flag to Greenwood Cemetery in Galena. She went early, before the ceremony, while dew still held in the grass and the flags placed by veterans groups stood straight beside stones. Reverend Boyd walked with her as far as the gate and then left her to continue alone. Mrs. Kettering had found the record in the county archive, a Whitcomb family marker near the older section, weathered but legible, with names added across generations as means allowed. Peter's name was there, though his body had not come home. Matthias's. Thomas's, marked lost at sea. Adelaide's name was cut at the bottom. Dates plain. No epitaph. Clara knelt and brushed grass from the base of the marker. She did not make a speech. She said the names because the note had asked for at least one. Peter Whitcomb. Matthias Whitcomb. Thomas Whitcomb. Adelaide Margarethe Whitcomb. Elias Whitcomb, though he rested elsewhere, deserved the heir too. She laid no claim aloud. She only placed one hand on the stone and let the morning pass through its own silence. The medal returned with her. The flag did too, after she had unfolded it once in the cemetery light and folded it again along its existing lines. She made an archival box from acid-free board ordered through the library and kept both in the studio cabinet, above flood height, below pride. The money remained mostly where waiting had first protected it. In the first winter, necessity had forced decisions, but Clara kept them narrow and recorded. 4 duplicate silver dollars had been sold through a reputable coin dealer in Dubuque to cover urgent materials before her candle orders began carrying the smaller costs. She chose duplicates by date, condition, and commonness, after asking the dealer for written valuations and walking away overnight before agreeing. Everything else returned to protection, the notes and sleeves, the gold wrapped in labeled cloth, the coins sorted and recorded, the tin box sealed inside a new cedar chest beneath the counter, not under the stone again but near enough to the work to remember its purpose. On the inside lid of the chest, Clara wrote in pencil, "For the next one, if care brings them here." She did not buy a car. She did not replace her clothes beyond necessity. She did not turn the studio into a museum, or her life into a story she had to perform. She paid Mr. Lutz every Friday once work began coming in, first in small bills, later in steadier amounts. On the day the account card reached 0, he placed it on the counter between them and drew one line through the total. Paid. Clara looked at the card. "Keep it," he said. She did. The shop reopened without a sign painter, ribbon, photographer, or announcement in the newspaper. It reopened through Doris's corkboard index card, then through a second card beneath it that said hand print, Nauticats available in small runs, and later through a mailing list kept in a cigar box beside the cafe register. Names entered the box slowly. Mrs. Kettering, Reverend Boyd, the retired cabinet maker, 3 women from the church supper committee, a teacher in Dubuque, a couple from Minnesota who had come for antiques and left with 6 candle labels, a seed saver in Elizabeth who wanted packet fronts printed in one color. Doris added names with the blunt handwriting of a woman who did not believe commerce needed decoration. By the second winter, there were 43 names. Not customers enough for fortune. Enough for continuity. Enough for paper to leave the drying line and enter kitchens, writing desks, church basements, gift drawers, and letters mailed to daughters in other states. Clara printed slowly, priced modestly, and declined work she could not do well. If someone wanted speed, she sent them elsewhere. If someone wanted perfection without the trace of handwork, she showed them the door kindly. Once a month, she held an open afternoon. People could come in, stand behind the counter rail, and watch a small demonstration on a sample stone. Children were allowed if they kept their hands behind their backs. Adults were reminded of the same. Clara explained water and grease, pressure and patience, the difference between a print and a copy. She did not tell the story of the hidden compartment unless asked directly, and even then she told it narrowly. Some things become cheaper when repeated for effect. The large limestone block remained mostly covered, not because she feared it now, but because she had come to understand that readiness can take the shape of restraint. She would use it when the right work arrived, not before. The cellar slab remained unlifted as well. Every few months she swept around it, checked for damp, traced the ampersand mark with her eyes, and left it in place. There would be time. Caleb returned with the sign in April, when the walnut catkins were out and the river had lowered after spring flood. He was taller by then, nearly a man, though still narrow in the wrists. The Schwinn had been replaced by a battered pickup borrowed from his uncle, and in the truck bed lay a long board wrapped in an old quilt. His mother came with him, Mrs. Pike at last made visible, a woman with tired eyes, a firm mouth, and hands that explained where Caleb had learned steadiness once his force found aim. "We made something," he said. "You and your—" And Silas told us when it was wrong. Then it must be right by now. He blushed and looked toward the truck. They carried the board to the porch and unwrapped it across two sawhorses. It was walnut, sanded smooth but not polished beyond its nature, the grain running in dark waves from end to end. Caleb had carved the letters by hand. Not perfectly. Better than perfectly. Each groove held the small variations of a blade guided with attention. The words followed the old sign, with one addition restored and made unmistakable. Whitcomb Daughters Lithographic. The ampersand was carved deep. The word daughters held plural authority, not as decoration, not as apology. Beneath the main line, smaller letters read, prints, labels, candles, paper. Clara stood before it long enough that Caleb shifted his weight. "I can fix the S if it is too deep." "It caught in the grain. It belongs there." Mrs. Pike looked at the sign, then at Clara. He would not take money for it. Clara turned to Caleb. "My mother said," he began, then stopped, because he knew they all remembered. This time Clara did not offer money. She went inside and returned with a wrapped packet of prints. The chickadee in the north window. The first acceptable proof, and 3 later ones pulled clean. She handed them to Caleb with both hands. "For your mother. And for you." He received them as if they were heavier than paper. Silas supervised a hanging from a chair he insisted was not needed while using it anyway. Mr. Lutz supplied screws and refused to call them a donation. Doris came down with coffee in a thermos and rolls in a cloth-lined basket. Reverend Boyd stood at the gate long enough to tip his hat when the sign settled against the porch beam. It did not make the studio famous. It made it named. That was different, and better. Later that summer, Clara began writing her own letter. She did not wait until illness forced the work from her. The original had taught her that inheritance should not be left entirely to emergency. She bought good paper from the same Chicago supplier that sent her lithographic crayons, cleared the front counter at dusk, lit one of the candles made from Doris's first promised payment, and set Adelaide's folded letter beside the blank sheet. She began with the same opening words. "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped for a long time. Not because she had nothing to say. Because saying it required choosing what to leave out. She would not write a tale of triumph. That would mislead the future. She would write instructions. Which roof seam had been repaired and where to check it first after storms. Which chimney joints were new and which still belonged to older hands. Where the well water test results were filed. Which supplier sent honest paper. How to mix candle wax without scorching. Which townspeople had given kindness without asking to be remembered. Where the money was kept, and why it was not to be spent for grandeur. Which stone was ready for practice. Which stone waited. She wrote slowly, over many evenings. Some pages held craft. Some held names. Some held warnings about damp, debt, haste, and the flattering danger of being praised for survival. She included no bitterness toward family. Not because there had been none, but because bitterness was not an heirloom she wished to polish. She wrote instead that a person may begin again without dragging every closed door behind her. When she finished the first draft, she did not seal it. She placed it in a folder marked ADD to this and kept it beside Adelaide's letter in the cabinet above the counter. In time, it would go where it belonged. Perhaps the cedar chest. Perhaps under the stone. Perhaps somewhere not yet revealed. The house would have its opinion. Clara had learned to wait for that. By the close of that year, the studio had seasons again. In winter, the front windows glowed by 4 in the afternoon, and passers-by on Water Street could see Clara moving between counter and press, lifting paper, trimming wicks, writing addresses. The dog, older and more certain of his rights, slept near the stove and accepted visitors only after Doris approved them. In spring, walnut pollen dusted the porch and the river ran high. In summer, the workroom stayed cool until noon, smelling of damp stone, ink, paper, and cut twine. In autumn, leaves gathered at the threshold and the roof shed rain in clear lines down the repaired edge. Nothing extravagant came. No reporter stood in the yard asking Clara to make grief useful for strangers. No distant relative appeared at the door with claims. No plaque declared the building saved by courage. The town adjusted itself around the fact of the studio the way towns do when a thing remains long enough. First as rumor, then as inconvenience, then as presence, then as something that seems to have always been there. Clara liked the final stage best. On the evening of December 12, 2025, 1 year after the first acceptable proof, she took the chickadee stone from the shelf and printed a run of 20 cards for the mailing list. The room held at 65 degrees. The ink behaved. The paper lifted clean. She hung each card on the line, one after another, and when the last was clipped, she looked toward the covered large stone, the cellar hatch, the mantel where the brass key had rested before finding its lock, and the cabinet where the letters kept company. The studio had been waiting, and so had she. A lithography studio waits. It has always waited. It waits in stone that remembers grease and water. It waits in tools wrapped against damp, in notes written by hands that knew they would not be present to explain themselves, in glass that bends light but still admits it, in floors darkened by labor, in cedar compartments, in trees that hold iron until weather opens them, in folded flags and unpaid kindnesses traveling quietly through years. It waits also in county offices, though no one there would say so. In Mrs. Kettering's desk, beneath the metal paperweight shaped like a courthouse, the softened $5 bill remained in the back of the drawer where she had placed it on the morning of the transfer. She had entered the payment properly. The record was clean. The deed was legal. But the bill itself stayed there, flattened and warm no longer. A private receipt for something procedure had not fully understood. Sometimes, when the office was empty and winter light lay across the counter, Mrs. Kettering opened the drawer to retrieve a stamp or a paper clip and saw it waiting there. She never moved it. Some records belong on paper. Some are kept.